Saul is Not Lost, a novel by Michael James Scharen, copyright 2020, Chapter 1, The Same Old Earth. The Earth is a great place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there. In fact, the planet was in better shape than it had been in ages, thought Trevor. As the blue-green orb slowly grew in front of him, he could see from space the changes thought miraculous a century ago. The Sahara forest was thriving, interspersed with vast agricultural areas feeding the 130 million souls that lived there. Trevor smiled quietly to himself as he thought of the millions of people who said the planet was dying from an overdose of plant food. As it turned out, the hysteria was only being drummed up by the usual controlled junkies. Only when it was blindingly obvious to even the woke that the earth was getting greener did that particular nonsense come to a stop. But there was always more where that came from. The control freaks and their ridiculous predictions of doom ever moving forward like shark's teeth. That was why these trips were becoming less frequent. There was only so much the rational mind could take. But the home planet was not fully industrialized, and there were the routine supply forays that brought Trevor back to Earth for some good old-fashioned black market trading. Of course, trading could be an overly generous term for the rather one-sided transaction that usually took place. Having discovered several asteroids here and in the new system, especially rich in rare metals and other elements, made things easier. Bartering with high-purity osmium, rhodium, platinum, titanium, or other coveted and untraceable commodities greased a lot of wheels. No one asked questions, and to hell with the tax man. All parties were happy. Trevor thought it was rather like the precocious American colonists trading with whomever they liked, and the British crown be damned. Then again, Trevor descended from a long line of pioneers who maneuvered and innovated their way from under the twin leviathans of government and polite society. After all, it was his great-great-grandfather, Marcus Aurelius Van Leeuwan, who invented the very technologies needed to escape that nightmare in the first place. History was repeating itself, just as those early colonists sought dark, quiet coves along the Atlantic coast to load and unload their cargo out of sight of the king's customs men. The equivalent had been found in these times. Private islands with private ports, secure communications, and the ever-present convenience of shell corporations and the Mars banks required a lot of maintenance as well. Trevor's contacts and middlemen were making a very comfortable living. Part of their wealth was derived from these deals, but the majority of their pay was for keeping silent. Snoopers were the ultimate threat, and more than one dealer or security man had been cut off from the gravy train for talking too much. Even then, are they going to go out and start telling people that they had been trading with another star system? They wanted to salvage what reputations they had left. The social controls were still stark, even in this century. People on Earth knew there was life elsewhere as it had been found over a century before on Mars and the moons of Saturn and Jupiter. The shock value had worn off as they figured it would be a very long time before any more significant contact was made. Microbes and fish, how exciting is that? And they simply did not have the technology to go looking elsewhere. The Earth loomed large in the window, nearly filling it now. The Pacific was below them, along with their several ports in French Polynesia, VLC's main port at Taha'a being today's destination. Van Leeuwan Corporation was one of the few operations that paid in this territory, into which the French still stubbornly hemorrhaged subsidies. The British were just as delighted to have them on Pitcairn Island. The irony of that facility on Pitcairn never ceased to amuse Trevor and his family, but it was a joke they could never tell anyone on Earth. He doubted they would find it funny that there was escape, even from lonely Pitcairn. and by the same brand of humans who first sought it out. Yet why were so many from Earth living in those miserable Mars lava tubes, recycling their own urine to grow vegetables, if they didn't find this planet stifling? Why did Fletcher Christian and his band disdain going back to grungy, class-driven England and prefer to stay in this paradise? Why did Russian monks continually move deeper into the forests to escape the Tsar? Civilization could kill a person as easily as cosmic rays or malaria. One didn't normally take this slow, leisurely pace, touching down on a routine cargo run, but it was helpful for one's psyche sometimes to take in the sights and ponder the big picture. Oceana was quite beautiful today. The ship did not care, as she could be programmed for almost any kind of approach. Most of the basic principles worked out by Great-Grandpa still govern their operation. Grandpa was an incessant tinkerer, but he had enough sense to stop when something could work reliably without more improvement. He could not stand working with those engineers who could never finish anything and hand it off to the people who needed to use it. Grandpa Marcus loved basic science and always had a hunch there was so much more there to discover. Why, he asked, did most basic research into the properties of electricity and magnetism stop after Faraday, for whom this ship is named, Maxwell, and Tesla? Years were spent in the garage pursuing various experiments, sometimes crossing over into the more esoteric fields of physics. This generated a lot of results that surprised even him, but he knew he could never let anything more than necessary go public. Human nature and the arbitrary hierarchies being what they were, those discoveries would not remain under his control for long. After all, Tesla's final notes were never published, and the era of big corporate science had begun with World War II, medicine even earlier. Worse than that, Allied and Axis companies traded technology throughout the war. The ancient classic maxim from the movie Network still held true. There were no countries, there were only corporations. Even if one developed a new technology in his or her garage, there were plenty of lawyers and bureaucrats who could make up excuses to steal it, such as national security. At any rate, the Van Leeuwan Corporation was literally light years ahead of the Earth-side corporate magnates. Grandpa Marcus' formulas and exquisite engineering could bend, twist, and squeeze space-time as easily as Earth lawyers could reshape their morals and the law. It was best not to give even the slightest pretense for probable cause. Not that any government really cared about that old trope. Still, VLC Earth facilities were vulnerable to the various military, mercenary, and SWAT teams wandering about. Those muscleheads didn't listen to reason, they just did what their paymasters told them to do. The port had defensive systems available, but they were to be used only as a last resort. If one wanted to maintain a low profile, breaking out Uber defenses would not be the way to accomplish it. Though the approach from space was slow, the drop through the last 20,000 meters was quick and precise. Through the open roof of the hangar and touchdown. Even out here in the boonies, it did not pay to have too many inquiring eyes. The countless satellites were another subject. With the roof moving back into position, Trevor moved down below to the cargo hold, which was essentially empty. The ship's large cargo bay doors were already opening to receive the latest consignment. He was purchasing a variety of equipment not yet available back home on Magellan. Adam Smith's invisible hand took a long time to develop in a world where there were only 11 million people. This shipment included the latest machine tools, additive manufacturing units of various types, from heavy equipment to chip-making equipment, materials processing and development items for building up new system industries. Along with this, a good collection of the latest scientific and medical literature was being uploaded into the Faraday's memory. In any case, he had a reliable crew working with the ground personnel here for keeping everything in order. Trevor was handling the payments in, now, precious metal ingots himself, and began pushing the cart toward his office. He would be meeting and paying his various agents over the next week. As he began stacking the ingots onto the shelves in his walk-in office safe, he admired the view out the window over the campus to a calm sea. It was a beautiful day. In fact, the days were never really terrible here. The weather modification arrays made sure that the worst typhoons could not do any real damage. If one could bend space itself, then locally diverting a tropical storm was not that difficult. The satellites could watch it happen in real time, but no one could distinguish its path from random chance. The rain was great as long as there was no flooding. He was surprised that no curious characters had ever asked how they had been so lucky. Some of the staff were out surfing or sailing on their days off. If he could squeeze it in, he might join them himself, though the beaches on Magellan were just as spectacular. His first appointment was tomorrow, so probably not. The office itself was spacious, with large windows facing the ocean. The opposite walls were dressed in some extremely exotic hardwoods he had imported from Magellan. He loved the intricate grains of the various types so much that he brought them here. Trevor didn't think there was much chance of someone chiseling off for DNA analysis. One had to live a little and take a few chances. This was his showpiece in Home Away from Home, where he made his deals to move the colony forward. One thing that was still true on Earth was that one had to show off a bit to impress people. At any rate, the decor was more for himself than it was for them, but enough of soaking in the ambiance. His secretary Megan, live, not artificial intelligence, had let him know that one of his field agents was there for their scheduled meeting, but had some important information for him, and that he looked nervous. Jeremy Vaughn came in hurriedly and paced in front of the large desk of solid amber. He never asked where that came from. He told Trevor that his people had checked out all of the additive manufacturing equipment that was being loaded. There were machines for metals, ceramics, and organics. Everything seemed to be working perfectly. Trevor already had all of this information and was passing the contracts across to Jeremy, who fumbled for his pen. All the places for him to sign had been indicated by the sterling Megan. It was obvious that he was trying to form words while he signed away, and his prepackaged sums of precious ingots were pushed across the desk. Finally, when he finished and took a quick look at his payment, he sat down on the edge of one of the large leather high-backed chairs in front of the desk. "Do you remember Dieter Hoffmann from that German satellite company?" asked Vaughn. It had been a while, but Trevor replied, "Yeah, he always wore those thick navy or black turtlenecks and those retro plastic-framed eyeglasses. And that cologne, that was the worst. What was it, raccoon?" "Well, he's been asking a lot of questions since then," said Vaughn. "Questions like, why did VLC want to buy so many satellites and never launched any of them? I mean, the guy is in the satellite business, so I guess he has a pretty good handle on who is launching what and when. Though he hasn't asked me directly yet. If he does get around to it, then what should I tell him?" Trevor replied, "Do you think he'll ask you? I mean, we did pay premium in order to get the first of that type off the line. It shouldn't matter to him what we do with them. Didn't you get them to sign a full non-disclosure agreement? That's built into all of our contracts anyway, unless some clever lawyer has found a loophole." Yeah, all that is in the contract and should be solid, but they started getting anxious about some performance data on this new line," remarked Vaughn. "So they're dropping coy hints at cocktail parties about our secrecy again. I never promised them any performance data anyway, and maybe we'll be lucky and it will just blow over." Trevor sat back and put his dark tan cowboy boots on the desk. "Every 5 or 10 years, VLC runs into this kind of thing. Mostly it's just competitive jealousy. We come up with our own innovations, but maintain them as trade secrets, and then one of our scientists wins a Nobel Prize being a private company. There's nothing they can do about it. What do you think? Are they going to try to reverse engineer our products? Good luck. Look, there are still trade secrets out there for soft drinks and fried chicken that have never been cracked." Vaughn relaxed a little and sat back. I know. We've seen this before. The social media, whispering campaigns, and conspiracy theories. We've always slipped through, though I have to say that some of the theories are pretty damn good. Some are almost right on the money." The more relaxed Vaughn got, the more agitated Trevor became. "We'll figure something out. It's just too bad that we needed those satellites in such a hurry. My fault. I thought we could slip this one through. Still, I'm glad we don't have to go through that archaic song and dance, relying on reaction engines to deposit our satellites into orbit. only for us to barely utilize the ones there and pluck the ones we needed out of orbit, claiming they malfunctioned. What a huge waste of time and money that was, all for the sake of appearances. That's why I want to get our own more advanced satellite production going ASAP. Why did the Chinese have to come up with such good satellite retrieval vehicles? That's all we need. Having some government spooks sniffing around accusing us of launching without a permit. If there is a way to hand out parking tickets in Earth orbit, those bloodsuckers will find it. Vaughn figured it was time to take his ingots and go. Maybe he had stirred up a hornet's nest unnecessarily. He'd head back to the guest bungalow and try to catch some waves today. His business here was done. Cash in hand, headache officially transferred. Was it time to start drinking yet? He smiled to Megan on his way out and got a nice one in return. He was going to enjoy the day while he could. Trevor was mildly stewing after his meeting with Vaughn. Let them whisper, he thought. VLC had been created in large part to counter this kind of thing. He had thought of winding things down in the Sol system, but there was always another reason to stay. The company had been family-run from the beginning and remained private. Far less disclosure to the SEC was required. No patents were ever filed because, by and large, if anyone tried to reverse engineer their most essential products and moneymakers, they would harmlessly self-destruct. That feature was so much stronger than a patent. There was a lot of philanthropic work to be done here. Van Leeuwan University trained some of the brightest minds on the planet free of charge. Of course, getting in was a course in major hurdles, and staying there the same. There were no other sons or daughters of the CCP, no legacy students who might skate in on their senator mother's coattails. All had scores of companies wanting to hire them on graduation. Once good students got in, however, there were some fantastic opportunities for some. How many astronomers were able to actually study a mini black hole from orbit? How many would be able to study a species based on something other than carbon? The downer was that you could never tell anyone about how you got your insight. But your theoretical work, based on your observations, would be sure to get you some attention, and stories about space aliens would get you nowhere fast. In any case, a significant proportion of these students became colonists on Magellan in the end. Oh well, he thought, back to the problem at hand. Deep in his gut, he knew people would be snooping and asking idiotic questions like, when are you going to apply for a launch permit for those satellites? Permits for this and licenses for that. A license to go out and work, a license to stay at home and work. It was all extortion. Right from the beginning, the cities and states wanted license plates for the recently invented automobile. There weren't even any roads. Horses were the ones dropping 20 pounds of manure on the streets each day, and they didn't require permission to use the public thoroughfares. Later, they wanted money for permission just to have a car, even if it never left the property. And of course, the traffic signal was invented almost immediately to extract more cash. Chapter 2. With friends like these, Trevor took a deep breath and asked Megan what was in store for the rest of the day. She had come up through the ranks and was fantastic. She practically was VLC Earthside. Just a luncheon at the Admiral's Club with the local dignitaries and another contract signing was all that was on the agenda. Sounds easy enough, he thought, but looks could be deceiving. The local dignitaries were gracious enough. They had to be, since VLC was propping up the local economy. Frowning, he remembered that there were still politicians and appointees. They always had their hands out for more, both above and below the table, and even their bosses got curious from time to time. Therefore, it was SOP for them to try increasing their percentage 24/7, 365. What else did they have to do? These islands practically ran themselves. Maurice Lavoisier, the president, was a wonderful example. He claimed to be a relative of the famous Antoine Lavoisier, who first isolated and discovered oxygen. He had all the energy, but none of the brilliance of his ancestor. And unlike that famous ancestor, he was not sticking his neck out for anyone, if the payoff was not high enough. With him was the ever-present security/bagman, Francois Levesque. Someone had told Van Leeuwan that several of Francois' ancestors had held similar positions under the Vichy regime, and he had no reason to doubt it. And here he was, seated at the same table as these two characters. There was the overdressed Lavoisier in his blue tunic, president's sash and sword, dying to make his speech or toast or whatever. Then there was his sidekick in the same old dark suit and thin dark tie. At least Levesque had taken off his ridiculous not-for-the-tropics fedora. The sunglasses stayed on, of course, though they were under the shade of a large canopy. The luncheon was another fill-in event, it seemed, for the local gentry who didn't know what else to do all day. Lavoisier was rambling on about the island economy and the need to work together as a team in public-private partnerships. Though Trevor had been drifting off, this kind of talk always set off his alarm bells. Hadn't VLC already been doing this? Hadn't they paid for the newly expanded port facilities, including accommodation for the local fishing fleets? Not to mention several locally owned workshops did a great deal of business with his company. Tourism and fishing were probably a third of the economy, while VLC and related businesses made up the rest. Public-private partnership just means that the private does all the work and government gets all the credit. Trevor waited for the other shoe to drop. Lavoisier sat down after the polite applause and his obligatory bow. It's amazing he hadn't put an eye out with that ridiculous sword. He smiled and made small talk with the rest of the guests at the table through the first course, then turned in Trevor's direction. Here it comes, he thought. You know, Monsieur Van Leeuwan, I'm partial to that tried-and-true method of MBWA, as the Americans say. You know, management by walking around. As president of these islands, I like to have a good working knowledge of what my constituents' hopes, needs, and goals are. We are all in this together, n'est-ce pas? As your recent build-out of the harbor showed us, a rising tide does lift all boats, does it not? Trevor was still waiting for the punchline as he sat perfectly still, without showing any reaction. How long are you in the islands for this time, Mr. Van Leeuwan? You know, I would just love to have a tour of your facilities. I have not done so since your latest expansion. There it is, the veiled bureaucratic threat. I authorized you, and I own you, so I can go wherever I like, whenever I like. This is what these bureaucrats live for, thought Trevor. They have never built anything with their own two hands, yet want to claim control over all those who did. You know, Your Excellency, this is a short trip for me, with several meetings planned far in advance. Lavoisier didn't flinch. Of course, this was just the response he was expecting. Their relationship had always been only a formal one. Each had despised the other from day one. They were not chummy. They did not play golf together. They only attended these meaningless functions. Trevor knew he would probably have a better time of it if he at least pretended to get along with these people, but they were just too different, too slimy. He did his best and was always courteous, but only to a point. My people tell me that VLC has not gone through their final inspection and approval for this round. Are they right? I was thinking I could, peut-être, take care of both of those tasks myself. It would save you some trouble and a lot of time. As a personal favor, of course. Otherwise, these things can get awfully messy and inefficient. We are both very busy men, no? I myself must be traveling to Berlin at the end of the week to meet with my counterparts. Trevor had to fight to keep the smile on his face as he thought of a reply. When are you traveling, Your Excellency? I might be able to squeeze you in at the end of the week. Say Friday afternoon? Lavoisier's face lit up like the proverbial cat that had swallowed a canary. He thought he had him this time, or was about to get something on the great Mr. Van Leeuwan. Fantastique, Monsieur Van Leeuwan. I will have my people arrange it with your marvelous Megan at once. Trevor still had a smile. It was so phony it hurt his face to keep it there, but the luncheon was ending, and he had to scramble for a solution. It was back to the office ASAP, but without that look of panic. Levesque, of course, had been quiet the entire time, looking for any tells in Trevor's behavior. Everyone filed out slowly and said their goodbyes until the next phony event or fundraiser. It was an odd set out here in French Polynesia. Their ancestors were the second string of those well off enough to escape the invasion of migrants to their old countries. The indigenous population here tried to ignore them for the most part, except when pointing out the obvious irony. New Zealand and Australia got the first waves of this new type of refugee, their redoubts complete with underground shelters. Earth was still very livable, but people were getting on one another's nerves. It was in the air. Lavoisier was going to Berlin to meet with his counterparts. German and French politicians acting all cozy was never a good sign. Ever since that last time they tried to take over Europe and failed, they have been antsy. Even the Mars colonies were getting contentious. Already the French had built 8 kilometers into a lava tube designated for the Russians, and it was getting ugly. The Russians, even after all this time, still could not get their act together and had barely started to build out the claims they staked over 100 years ago. By all rights, they should have to give them up, being one of the largest countries on the home planet, and no organizational skills. But such was Earth politics. SpaceX, as the biggest player on Mars, tried to referee some of the disputes with marginal success. VLC had a respectable presence on Mars, but until recently it was confined to shipping, mining, or sales and information gathering. It would look strange if one of the biggest tech companies had no presence there. One had to keep a hand in as well as keep up appearances. Only a handful of trusted employees knew of their presence in the news system. The lunch gala had taken place near Papeete, but now it was time for Trevor to get back to Taha'a to get his people started squaring everything away for Lavoisier's snooping tour. More than likely, it would be Megan's plan that was implemented. She practically ran the place and had almost instant recall of any fact, figure, or personality. He hopped into his levacraft, closed the canopy, and started her up. Quietly, the blades revved up, and the craft lifted off as the kickstands retracted. Turning, he moved slowly down the road and out over the water, letting the computer take over as it searched for an available lane. Thankfully, these islands were still so sparsely populated that there was almost never anyone in your inter-island hover lane. The computer locked on to an available lane and moved the craft up to about 40 meters above the gentle waves, turning northwest for home, away from home. The speed increased to 250 kilometers per hour, while the trusty sensors scanned for birds or other hazards. Laying back in the comfortable leather seat, he put in a call to Megan back at VLC headquarters. "Megan, hello," said Trevor. "You'll never guess what our friend the president would like to do." She jumped right in before he could finish. "You mean the dog and pony show this Friday?" "Yes. I bet you two were barely out of sight of each other before I got the call from his chief of staff. I'm already on it. Any residual construction trash is being cleaned up, and we're started putting everything in order." "I feel better already," Trevor sighed. "I'm already on my way back from Tahiti, so I should be there shortly. Say, just to be safe, there are murmurs about those satellites from OHB. As in, where are they? I hope you can get some of our best people on some kind of contingency plan." Megan quipped, "We're all over it, Chief." At least communications were airtight. Developing secure communications was how Grandpa Marcus started this whole empire. He managed QSTC, Quantum Secure Direct Communication, on a microchip that could be incorporated into any communication system. Overnight, every company in telecommunications had to have these chips. They were the biggest sensation since the smartphone. Governments hated it, of course, and many resisted for a long time. With this law or that, it was just too bad. The people wanted it, and the time was right. No one could bow to that kind of pressure, not even governments. Once it was explained to people that their communications simply could not be spied on, or if they were, you would be instantly notified someone was listening. There was no putting that genie back in the bottle. Of course, there were still a few holdouts, but what could they do? The best part was no competitor could duplicate it, even if they thought they knew how it worked. They tried for years, but every attempt to reverse engineer the chips just destroyed them. It was a money machine on the order of Howard Hughes drill bits. As the chips were rapidly implemented into the networks, the most interesting thing happened, or didn't happen. The fearmongers' claims that crime would skyrocket or terrorism would be out of control simply never materialized. The stock market was not nearly as volatile as before, but that should have told everyone something. The hacking problem also dropped significantly. Van Leeuwan could see the port of Taha'a coming up in the distance. It is such a beautiful day, he thought. No one should be panicking on a day like this. The ship and boat traffic was increasing, and the computer was making altitude adjustments to compensate. The craft decelerated as the VLC main building loomed larger. Then, moving up, she sat down on the rooftop pad near the elevator to his office. Looking down onto the campus from the roof, Trevor could notice that the activity level had indeed increased. Damn, they were good people, and Megan worked them like an orchestra. It was only Tuesdays, so there should not be any reason that things are not ship-shape by Friday morning. The issue at hand was still that bit about the German satellites. Had Hoffman and Lavoisier been in contact? Possibly Dieter and Levesque? Trevor wasn't worried about the satellite company so much as their innocent questions. Their inquiries could supply ammunition to Lavoisier, Levesque, or any of their counterparts in the Franco-German government. At any rate, Megan said she was on it, and that was enough. He wondered how she would be able to conjure half a dozen prospecting satellites that were already orbiting a planet in a distant solar system. All of the delivery contracts to VLC were signed off like clockwork and expedited to finish midday on Thursday. This was done in order to get the Faraday loaded and cleared out of the hangar, as that was part of the president's special tour. There would be nothing in it but lots and lots of empty by the time his entourage got there. The facility on Taha'a concentrated on specialty shipbuilding and undersea mining equipment, all of it very, very large. That explained the hangar. But this only added fuel to the fire for anyone wanting to know why satellites would be transshipped so far out of the way. There was a launch facility in the islands, so it wasn't a total stretch, but satellites are generally shipped there directly. Today was the day, however. Trevor hoped that Lavoisier and his slew of government lackeys had been sufficiently feted in the company dining hall. The chefs had outdone themselves once again, he thought. Too bad it has been wasted on this horse's ass and his minions. They would not appreciate it. Levesque still had bits of Alaskan crab in his teeth, but who was going to tell him? They had toured the impressive dry docks with their high-speed pumps. The assembly area for the deep-sea boring machines was always impressive. Redesigned versions of some of these machines were in the works for Mars, since a good lava tube was not always where you wanted one. Even those needed branches and niches. Services would definitely go for a premium, since no one else wanted to pay all of the freight charges for such heavy machines, even if they were delivered in so many pieces. VLC University had a branch here, so they toured some of the labs. Graduate students and postdocs were madly studying, classifying, and pondering uses for the diverse DNA of the South Seas. Mars did indeed have life on it, as the very first Viking landers had determined. The problem was, it just wasn't very interesting. They used almost the same DNA with the same nucleotides as Earth life, with just enough differences to let you know it was alien. In addition, the mad dash of the colonists had pretty well contaminated the surface, at least. The truth was that there was nothing very distinctive about these bugs, other than being tough enough to live in an extremely cold, salty environment in a near-constant state of suspended animation. These traits were primarily the study of those who thought humans should enter the same state for long space trips. All the while, Levesque's eyes were moving over every unopened door or room divider, while he made less than subtle hand signs to Lavoisier. Lavoisier looked a bit sleepy from his huge lunch, yet he didn't fail to mention the last building they had not entered. Megan told him that it was nothing interesting, just more clean rooms. That did the trick. Lavoisier insisted that they all go and check it out. It was a matter of duty with him now as president and inspector. So they all marched across the quad to the last building. There was an observation corridor, so they did not all have to get into bunny suits. The people inside were used to being in the fishbowl and went about their work. The last room was larger than the rest, with 5 platforms. Each platform had a large cloth cover over whatever was in place on top of it. Trevor was trying to usher everyone outside to end this thing. Of course, Lavoisier stopped and held both hands up in the air. Attendez un moment, monsieur. Please ask your technicians to raise those covers, please. Trevor tried to protest, but Megan spoke into the intercom to the technicians in the room. Go ahead, boys. Let's let our visitors see what's behind the curtain. One by one, the covers were raised. Under each cover was a bright, shiny satellite with solar panels, contracted in various parts wrapped in mylar and gold. Prominently affixed to each one was an OHB logo and a German flag. Levesque looked confused, and Lavoisier a bit crestfallen, but perhaps his lunch feast made up for it. It appears that these satellites were not orbiting in unauthorized space. Perhaps their information had been faulty. Though everyone was told to refrain from photography, there was almost nothing anyone could do about it these days. The cameras were so bloody small and could be hidden anywhere. Some people even had them implanted under their skin. At any rate, Levesque swore he was not missing a trick, at least not in the long run. Lavoisier made good on his promise and signed off on all the government inspection documents Megan indicated. He looked a bit grim, but couldn't renege in front of his audience. At any rate, he posted that phony smile once more and shook hands with everyone. Trevor and Megan waved to them all as they entered their oversized, black, luxurious, taxpayer-funded Levacraft and ambled off over the ocean. He turned to her with the inevitable questioning look. I had those weather satellites brought over from the launch facility, since we still had them in stock, Megan said. I did some digging and figured that neither Lavoisier nor his sidekicks knew that much about satellites, and that appears to be the case. Neither of them has probably ever seen one up close and personal. Then I had the machinists make up 5 sets of OHB emblems with German flags to attach there in plain sight. Trevor gave out a great sigh of relief. Once again, Megan, you have worked your magic, Trevor said. Gave her a big kiss on the cheek. I'll take it for now, but you know these things are never really over. As the president's party ambled southeast over the Pacific back to the capital, under the vast blue skies of Oceania, Lavoisier squirmed in his plush leather seat. He was a bit tipsy from that fabulous luncheon, but figured it was Friday afternoon, and he was the boss, so what the hell? He told the limousine bar to pour him one of his best cognacs. The rest of the group was lost in their own pursuits, or having VR conferences with people who knew where. He thought that this time, for sure, he would have something to contribute at his next meeting in Berlin. His spies inside the VLC campus were low level, but they came up with good intelligence once in a while. This time it was the stacking up of great shipments of equipment from several different companies, and no evidence of transshipment to points beyond. However, since they were low-level moles, they didn't have high enough level clearances to pursue their leads. Van Leeuwan Corp was a big prize, one of the few purely private entities on Earth or anywhere else. Its business was done quietly at the highest levels of excellence and professionalism. They never advertised, and as far as anyone knew, there had never been a serious complaint against them. Their competition in and out of government, and the difference was difficult to ascertain, was always looking for a chink in the armor. Any means, legal or extra-legal, to get a peek under the hood at their fabulous technology was a constant pursuit. If only he could be the one to ease the camel's head under the proverbial tent, he would be set for life. Lavoisier was nearing the end of his cognac and pondered another, but he had to keep his head clear for a while. VLC could be dumping their brand new equipment into the depths of international waters, and there was not a thing he could do about it. Chapter 3. The Stowaway. Kimberly McDonough had been with the Corp for almost 2 years. Before that, she had been a Starliner pilot making the Mars-Earth runs for a decade. That was rather humdrum stuff, and she was known for being a bit of a daredevil when she could get away with it. She thought of it rather like the surface truck drivers in the days of old, or maybe an airline pilot. The jobs took skill, concentration, and quick thinking at times, But the challenging days were past. Even today, with the best ion drive rigs out there, the Mars Earth run was still 5 to 7 weeks, depending on the time of year, and Isaac Newton did most of the driving. That's a lot of time to think about one's future. She had run into Van Leeuwan's right hand, Megan, on one of her cruises. She invited her to dine at the captain's table one evening, and they became fast friends. Both being very dynamic people, they recognized this trait in the other, and before long they were spilling out their life stories. Now, Megan and most of the rest of those who spent time both around Sol and the news system were constantly looking for top talent. Kimberly seemed to meet the requirements for both VLC and news system colonists. She had almost no family ties back on Earth or Mars. She was definitely undertaxed in her job, on the lookout for new opportunities, and took to new experiences like a fish to water. And now she was the captain of the Faraday. Too bad they can't see me now, she mused. Though she had been voted most likely to exceed, she was interrupted by a warning she had never heard countered before. "Intruder alert! Intruder alert!" the calm voice stated in the not overly loud but unignorably male British accent of the ship's computer. "Infrared readings are being tracked between decks 4 and 5. Please advise." Kimberly switched one of her viewers to show a diagram of the ship layout and zeroed in on the infrared tracks for the last 10 minutes. It was pretty uninteresting to start with. There was just a red blob off the main cargo deck. Then about 5 minutes later, the blob widened out, getting kind of blurry, but turning into a line, moving down the corridor of Deck 5 and up the stairs to Deck 4, slowly moving down the Deck 4 corridor. At this point, Kimberly flipped on the local lighting so it would track the infrared path. "It's a goddamn stowaway," Kimberly grumbled aloud to her first officer. "I wonder how he managed to stay out of sight of eyes and sensors the whole week. He must have found just the right electromagnetic hidey hole and only moved when we did." The first officer stood there with his arms crossed, staring at what appeared to be a rather frightened young man on the viewer, trailing a long, blurry tail to the lower deck. First Officer Justin O., never at a loss for words, just said, "Yup." "Well, at least it gives us something to do," Kimberly chuckled. "It sure adds a little something to doing figure eights between the Earth and the Moon for the next few days." Kimberly switched on the local intercom to speak to their visitor. "This is Captain McDonough of the cargo ship Faraday speaking. You are not authorized to be aboard this ship. Please stay where you are, and you will be escorted to the detention area." Justin smiled at the captain with the unspoken query, "What do you mean, detention area?" "Computer, please close off the intruder's area at the nearest convenient points," Kimberly requested. "Path to Deck 5 sealed. Main corridor on Deck 4 secured from intruder," replied the computer. "Okay, Justin, let's go. Do you want to be good cop or bad cop? Either way is all right with me. This is my first stowaway, but let's go by way of the main cargo hold. I have an idea." The captain and first officer strolled down to main cargo while intermittently monitoring their catch on the portable monitors. He looked increasingly nervous, but was trying to be stoic at the same time. This was a younger guy, blonde, muscular, tattooed, and buzz-cut, possibly ex-military, probably had never lost a contest in his life. On entering main cargo, Kimberly said, "Justin, look for one of those gravity carts, would you?" As they walked between the rows of equipment, they looked for one of the large orange and white striped carts. Justin spied one and retrieved it out of its charging bay. Kimberly grabbed the remote from its cradle in the onboard panel and locked out local controls in favor of the remote. She set the cart for follow and then wandered over to the large elevators. "I can tell you have a few things in mind. I can hear the cogs turning inside your skull," said Justin, smiling. "You could be bad cop, of course." The elevator arrived at Deck 4, and their prize in the next corridor over. With the cart following behind, they arrived at the door, separating them from their visitor. Kimberly pressed the local intercom. Please step away from the door, back toward the opposite corridor bulkhead. Their quarry had a pissed-off look on his face now, but he reluctantly complied with the order. Quickly, Kimberly opened the door and commanded the gravity cart through the opening, while the door closed again behind it. Fortunately, the door closed in time, but it did not matter. Their prisoner saw this as his only chance to possibly escape, so he lunged toward both of them. Evidently, he planned to spring and jump on or over the cart and get to them before the door slammed shut once more. On the way up to this deck, Kimberly dialed the local gravity cart to 4G. As this strapping 100-kilogram man stepped onto the cart, his mass may still have been 100 kilograms, but he weighed 4 times what he did off the cart. He slumped down onto the cart face first and was instantly pinned to it like a butterfly in an old cigar box. He had trouble breathing and could not lift his arms or legs. Perfect, thought Kimberly. He should be easy to handle for a while. She heard nothing from him but muffled, unintelligible speech. To break room 2, shall we, Justin? Kimberly smiled. You got it, Chief, said Justin, and followed her and the cart down the passageway. They entered break room 2 and parked the cart near the rear wall by the entertainment monitors. Next, they went through the room and removed any of the knives or other possible weapons from the kitchen area. As this guy was not having a good time, they were quick about it, but thorough. Kimberly and Justin backed up toward the main door. There was no detention area, really, on the Faraday, so this would have to be it. There were sofas, a bathroom, shower, stocked kitchen, entertainment, etc. As they reached the outer door, Kimberly slowly dialed the gravity from 4G back down to 1G. He just lay there for a moment, breathing heavily now that he could, and slowly got up onto his hands and knees. Realizing he was up, he scampered off the cart and ran onto the floor. The cart was commanded to leave the room. It did so promptly, while the door closed tightly. As the cart passed, she dropped the remote back into the main panel. The cart would return to its last known charging station. The subject in break room 2 slowly came to his feet, looking really pissed off now. He felt like he had been punched out by a ghost. He was literally almost knocked out by his own weight. Justin said, Are you feeling okay now? You know, I really can't control what my commanding officer here does. Kimberly kept a straight face. Our database identifies you as Lucas Diamandis, with the last known residency before Taha'a of Heraklion in the Hellenic Republic. Is that correct? Of course they knew who this guy was, sort of. He was not a pro, though it looked as if he was trying to achieve that status. He checked out as healthy with no chronic issues. Main computer identified him as a VLC employee who had been working since March, most likely placed there by Levesque. They weren't going to acknowledge that connection, though. It was best to maintain distance. He didn't know these were VLC employees since they never came ashore, even in the hangar. It was best to keep it that way. Lucas just gave them both an icy stare through the glass. Justin said, We'll come back for another round in a few hours. We know you have been hiding out for days, and we don't know what you've been eating. If anything, the break room is well stocked and has everything you need for a feast except alcohol, so live it up. Any instructions you need to get through the main computer voice control or panels you have available. We'll pass some fresh clothes and sundries through to you as well. If you have any specific requests within reason, let us know. Meanwhile, make yourself at home. Captain McDonough and Mr. O went back to the bridge, both lost in thought. The moon was looming ever larger in the wide windows ahead. New system ships rarely stayed on the surface for long here. It was better for security reasons to stay in space in a kind of holding pattern, simple orbit or parked at a Lagrange point. They hadn't had much discussion or training with regard to stowaways, since everyone felt such a contingency was incredibly remote, at least from Earth, Moon, Mars. All of the ground and warehouse personnel working anywhere near an intersystem craft were cleared to the highest levels. Ground security was just so tight that they never really thought about it. Other than contacting the head office and keeping him or her on ice, there wasn't much really to go on. Kimberly believed their guest just needed some gentle persuasion to cough up a few answers. She sensed through his tough guy act he was feeling a bit like a fish out of water right now. His communications were cut off. There was no evacuation team waiting to rescue him. Well, there was a team, but they had no idea where he was. Mr. O was watching the viewer linked to Break Room 2 as Lucas had stopped pacing like a caged animal. He was going over the menus and looking through the pantry, evidently deciding that there was nothing sinister about this setup. Many of the selections were not familiar to him, but several seemed to satisfy. He was so hungry he could eat a horse. Ordering up a good-sized steak with baked potato, bread, corn on the cob, and a big glass of milk, he thought of those power bars and leftovers he had filched from the crew the last 2 days. A large cold beer did sound good, though. Too bad it was locked up. As he ate, savoring his first real meal in days, he went over the clothing choices and ordered the ones he wanted. He had taken a shower and changed into the basic crew coveralls they placed in the pass-through. They made him give up his boots, watch, clothes, and anything they thought might be hiding communications devices, explosives, tools, or weapons. "It looks like our guest is getting comfortable, Captain," Mr. O said as he gestured toward the viewer. "You're right, it does look like he's getting the hang of it. Let's give him another 2 hours to digest his food. You don't want to dive back into the pool too early," she grinned. Justin knew something was up by that look on the captain's face, but he had long ago given up trying to figure out what she was scheming in advance. He just knew it would be a good story for the other flight crews at numerous pubs in the future. Captain McDonough had been hunkered down with main computer, working up some new mischief for the last hour and a half. She had called up the exo-loader from the cargo bay below and was modifying its programming. These loaders were electromechanical enhancements for the cargo bay personnel for extra lifting power. Essentially, they were close-fitting exoskeletal forms worn by the users. Muscle movement translated to the exoskeleton, which mimicked and amplified the power of the user's muscles and bones, while bearing the forces instead. They were initially developed for travelers to those worlds which had gravities of up to 4G, though the earlier units were not as compact as these. The originals were designed to use over pressure suits or were just bulkier in general. Those with musculature issues would wear exoskeletons designed for every day, and new colonists on Magellan would wear similar aids while they adapted to a gravity of about 1.4 G. Since they might need the prisoner to move about, the suit was the best solution they had on hand. Nobody wanted to be cuffed to him the whole time. The captain was modifying the suit controls to respond to her voice data commands in override, as well as the wearer's own motions. Better safe than sorry. The captain was also running some simulation patterns with the Faraday's external gravity arrays. It was time to give Lucas another courtesy call. Mr. O and the captain stood up and started toward the rear of the bridge. Kimberly turned and said to the exo-loader, "Number 3, follow." Not worrying about giving it a clever name, Kimberly had stuck with the unit number on the loader. The loader stood up and walked toward them, stopping within about a meter. "Man, that thing is creeping me right out," Justin exclaimed. "Yeah, I know, it gives me the willies too, but it was all I could come up with in a pinch. Let's hope it has the same effect on our non-paying passenger." Walking down to deck 4, the unit paced behind them by about 2 meters. They arrived at Break Room 2 with the exo-loader off to the side and out of sight, just to the right of the door lock. "We're going to come in now, Lucas, and we're all going to be civil, right?" said Justin. Lucas was at the back of the room, on one of the sofas. He was taken by surprise, but didn't have time to respond, or try again to escape. So he just sat back again and glared. He still had no idea where he was. Maybe it was some kind of underground or undersea facility. There was no way of knowing because the computers had locked him out of any such information. Walking around was a little trippy, not quite steady. Maybe he was at sea. The captain came in with Mr. O, and Lucas rose up. He was like a coiled spring. Then the exo-loader walked in behind them, and he got a cold chill. He paused, halfway up and halfway seated, not knowing which way to go. As they came in to the entertainment area, With that thing hot on their heels, he collapsed back on the sofa. He had never seen anything like it. He had seen exoskeletons and had even used them back in his military days, but this didn't register as one of those. This thing almost looked like the shell of a human. That is, if humans shed their skins like snakes or crabs. It looked more like some sort of cybernetic being. The muscles were bioelectrical rather than electromechanical. Basically, the shell consisted of synthetic muscle compartmentalized to fit a human being. Lucas knew artificial muscle was one of the holy grails of robotics. Battery technology was very advanced, but nature had made muscles far superior to metal and composites in strength, flexibility, and versatility in a compact form. Think of the difference between a chimpanzee and a human. A chimpanzee was more than twice as strong as a human, packed into a smaller body size. Kimberly and Justin sat down opposite their prisoner. Number 3 stayed standing. "So," Kimberly started, "you've had a nice meal, a shower, and clean change of clothes, taken a nice little snooze. Are you feeling a little more talkative now?" In reply, she received the same glare she got hours before. "You two are in a lot of trouble," Lucas shouted. "This is kidnapping, plain and simple. I demand to know where I am this minute." "Lucas, if that is indeed your real name, you need to calm down. I'm sure whoever put you up to your shenanigans will be patient, even if you fail to cooperate." Justin replied, "We just want to know who you are really working for and what you're up to." "What do you mean, who am I working for?" "I work for VLC in Taha'a. I wandered into the hangar, and now I've been lost for 4 days," Lucas exclaimed with a slight worried look. "I have a few questions myself, like who the hell are you two, and why is she called Captain? Are we at sea? Why are you keeping me here? And what the hell is that thing standing next to you?" Kimberly replied, "I suppose, yes, you could say we are at sea, though I am not at liberty to tell you where. I am Captain Kimberly McDonough, and this is my first officer, Mr. Justin O. You are aboard the cargo freighter Faraday. Regardless, we don't take kindly to stowaways, even if you are our first one. And as for our mechanical friend here, I refer to it as number 3. We'll just call it an insurance policy for now, depending on your behavior. Now it's your turn. Who are you really? You don't strike me as your average cargo handler, and you look a bit out of place in the South Seas. You act like you're on a more important mission. So what gives?" And there was no response, just that icy stare again. "So that's it," she said. "You're just going to give us the name, rank, and serial number routine? I'm pegging you for ex-military with some kind of special training. Am I getting warm?" Mr. O had been looking at his viewer and giving it an occasional keyword query. "I've run his face, voice, and DNA through most of the databases, but there's no ID yet. He certainly doesn't match for Lucas Diamandis, though he did until shortly after we left port. He's been erased, so I'm also guessing he's a merc of some kind, though corporate or government remains to be seen. Oh, and it looks like the results of his last company, Physical, were far above average." "Do you hear that, Lucas? It looks like your handlers have burned you already." Hearing that, Lucas did a head fake and bolted for the door. Kimberly said, "Number 3, block door and secure suspect." The exoloader made 3 great leaps and was at the door just before Lucas arrived. As the man slid to a stop, the exoloader grabbed his wrists and raised them over Lucas' head. He struggled, but the loader was just too powerful for him. He tried to kick him, but he wasn't in a position to do any damage. Now he just stood there looking embarrassed, having expended his big move. "Naughty, naughty," Kimberly said as she wagged her finger at Lewis. "I had a feeling you were going to be difficult. We thought we would give you a little freedom of movement, but we can only go so far. We have to maintain security. I'm sure you understand. So we came up with a compromise. Number 3, wrap." Upon Kimberly's command, the forearm portions of Faraday exoloader number 3 opened and locked around the forearms of the prisoner. Next, the upper arms activated, followed by the skull and thorax sections. The hand portions let go, and number 3 moved its arms apart and up slightly like a referee indicating a field goal. The finger sections then locked around Lucas, individual fingers. The hip, thigh, and shin sections followed quickly after that. Last but not least, the boot sections locked around Lucas' new tennis shoes. The entire process was less than 20 seconds. It looked to Justin as if he had been rapidly zipped into a man-shaped sleeping bag, except that the bag was not fully closed. The exoloader only made contact where it required reading muscle cues from the user. The number of those contacts and the strength of materials, however, were quite sufficient to cage a person completely. It was a bit like being inside an Iron Maiden that you could walk around in. For the user who had full control of the unit, it was like a second skin, since it was under his or her complete control. It moved like a shadow when the user was working, and unless he or she were extremely claustrophobic, there was no feeling of confinement. Lucas was not afforded that courtesy of full control. He thought to himself, this must be what a grasshopper feels like after it lands in a spider's web. Chapter 4. Walking the Plank. It feels just like a hug from Mother, eh, Lucas? Kimberly smiled. Now you can do this the easy way or the hard way. The suit is programmed to follow your lead, unless you move in any unauthorized direction or attempt any violence or sabotage. He turned toward the door once more, but when he raised his hands toward the panel to open it, his motion was frozen centimeters away from the controls. When he motioned to turn back into the room, he could move freely. Tentatively, he walked back to the entertainment area and the sofas. There was no resistance going that direction. Once again, Lucas, just who are you and who are you working for? And finally, what are you really after? These are simple questions. I can't imagine they're paying you enough to keep such secrets. Let's take a walk while you think about it. The captain was already standing at this point, gesturing for Mr. O to do the same, then slowly walking toward the door. You two follow me. Mr. O, is there anything going on in the portside auxiliary cargo bay? Not this trip, Captain, replied Mr. O. Then let's go that way, Kimberly said with a wink. The trio went out the door and back to an elevator. This was weird, thought Lucas. He could make the effort to follow the crew, or not. Either way, he was doing it. If he tried to stop, the machine would just override in favor of the captain. The captain made her way through a couple of long passageways. There wasn't a lot of detail for Lucas to take back to his minders so far. One thing was for sure, this didn't look like any ship he had ever been aboard before. There was no sense of motion and no feel of any kind of propelling machinery. There wasn't any sort of cyclic thrum one might get from pistons or turbines. Occasionally, signs indicated forward or aft. They had taken what he thought to be a corridor, far too long to be a beam, yet that is what the signs indicated. At last they came to a wide corridor that ran parallel outside of a large room, or hold. Large windows lined the wall along the passageway, and inside he saw a number of unfamiliar vehicles and some heavy equipment used for obscure purposes. Everything in the hold was lashed down firmly, as he would have expected. A big heavy door hissed open, and inside he could see a large sign that confirmed that this was the portside auxiliary hold. Lead the way, said Mr. O. Justin knew from his personal monitor that the Faraday had returned to Earth by this time, and had slowly taken up a position about 1,000 meters over St. Helena Island. After Lucas walked inside, the door to the hold hissed as it closed. He looked around, but there was no one behind him, and his gut tightened a little. The hold was quite large, about 3 stories high, maybe 50 meters wide. He didn't know how long, but now he could see a slight curvature of the hull. Now he started walking, through no will of his own. He rode to the opposite side of the bay, where some scaffolding equipment was attached to the wall. His host pulled one of the long scaffolding planks and tied down the rest. The plank was about 4 meters long, and he carried it back to the near center of the floor, laying it down over a rectangle marked out in double yellow lines. These were metal planks that had an array of holes in them, so they could be used to thread tie-downs wherever it was convenient. He pulled the plank back over one edge of the yellow lines and unscrewed an eye bolt from the deck, then passed it through the plank to attach the end to the plank over the edge of the yellow lines. The loader did torque it down pretty tightly, Lucas had to admire. Now, have you thought about the questions we've been asking you, Lucas? Kimberly said loudly from a second-story catwalk inside the cargo bay. Her voice bounced off the walls all around, then disappeared down the length of the hull. The deck inside the yellow rectangle dropped down with a hissing noise similar to the door. In two halves, the door recessed backward into the deck of the ship as a large gaping hole opened up. Lucas thought he saw a bird flying for a second as he fought for some kind of understanding. Kimberly said slowly, "You know, Lucas, for thousands of years it has gone without question that the captain is the law aboard ship. You are trespassing on my ship. Until I know otherwise, I must only assume the worst-case scenarios, i.e. you are a saboteur, an agent, a thief, or have some other nefarious purpose." Lucas could see an island far below, but could not identify it. This was definitely not a ferry boat. Then he started walking, slowly. He took a step onto the plank, facing the gaping hole in the ship, then another and another toward the end of the plank. When they reached the end, he stopped. He could feel the wind now, buffeting him inside his exoskeleton. The communication switched to his companion. "I've never had anyone walk the plank before, Lucas. You are my first. Man, this is going to make a great story. Are we jogging your memory at all?" Lucas was not feeling so cocky anymore. The exoskeleton was leaning over the edge of the plank, making him stare down toward the earth. He was tough, though. Kimberly had to give him that. She had the exoskeleton stand up and turn its back from the outside end of the plank, then step backward into the void. The couple fell 2 meters before the arms and hands snapped up to grab the end of the plank. The exoskeleton hung on tightly and began to sway back and forth, like a trapeze artist. It swung upward and looped its shins around the plank, let the hands go and hung upside down, putting its head back or making Lucas do the same. Of course, the Faraday's video systems are capturing everything for the scrapbook. Mr. O wasn't sure, but it looked like there was a bit of a wet spot at the crotch of Lucas' coveralls. "You'll never get away with this," Lucas shouted toward the sky below. "It's the middle of the Atlantic. I doubt they will be looking for you here, if there's anything left to look for," the captain said over his earpiece. "So who is your handler? What were you looking for?" "You know, if I tell number 3 to let go, he will. He is only a machine. But then again, that wouldn't do either of us any good, would it?" Lucas was trying to figure out how to buy himself some time. "I don't even know his name. He never told me, so I couldn't tell you, even if I wanted to." The exoskeleton started to sway back and forth, while they both hung upside down. Lucas was getting a little dizzy. Then the exoskeleton swung way out from the end of the plank, launching them through the air toward the opposite edge of the portal. He was too terrified even to scream. The exoskeleton grabbed the opposite edge of the portal and swung back and forth for a bit, then just by one arm. Mr. O had to turn around because even he did not know what the captain was up to. He was getting queasy just watching. Personally, he had checked all the ship's systems, including the ventral gravity arrays, and everything was functioning in tip-top order. Still, he could feel the butterflies in his own stomach. When he turned around, the exoskeleton was hopping from one side of the chasm to the other, with choreographed slipping and falling in between. Now he had to fight to keep from laughing out loud. Over the comms, he could hear Lucas breathing heavily, grunting, squealing. And was that a little crying also? "Okay, the guy's name was Gagnon, Henri Gagnon, from Papite," Lucas shouted. Number 3 was now jumping and doing mid-air somersaults over the gaping portal. The moves were getting creative indeed, thought Mr. O. "That's better," Kimberly intoned. Number 3 was doing pirouettes about the edge of the portal now. "What does this guy look like? Can you describe him, please?" the captain asked. Sheer terror was interfering with Lucas' ability to think clearly. "He'll kill me, you know, if I say anything." "It's a big ocean out there," said Kimberly. She already had an idea, just from the alias Gagnon, meaning guard dog in French. How unimaginative. Let me guess. Does this guy always dress in dark, heavy clothing, even in the islands? Is he about 50 years old, kind of funny but sinister looking, and wears dark glasses even indoors?" she continued. Lucas figured they seemed to know enough already, all on their own. "Yeah, it seems like you already know who he is, so I don't have to tell you anymore," he said quickly. Number 3 seemed like it was taking a break, if robots could do that. It was just walking him around the edge of the hole in the ship. The suit was outfitted with body monitoring sensors as part of its feedback system with a wearer. Mr. O had been browsing the record just to make sure there wasn't some kind of medical episode. The guy was in great shape, probably at Merck again, as they were guessing. His pulse and respiration rate went spiking there a few times when he thought he was going to slip over the edge, but they were within decent levels. And despite the nice breeze at this altitude, he was sweating profusely. "So what does Monsieur Gagnon want you to do for him?" Kimberly said, as she watched number 3 and pondered his next move. Lucas thought maybe he was out of the woods, getting near the end of his torture. "I can't say any more. The sky is just too well connected." "Connected, huh? What do you mean by that?" the captain said curiously. Lucas figured he had said enough. Time to clam up. "I can't say anything more," he claimed. "Tisk, tisk. I'm afraid that's not going to be good enough, Lucas. I don't think you've earned your fare on this ship," the captain said firmly. "I'm afraid you are going to have to produce your ticket, or we will have to eject you from the ship. We have 10 seconds to comply. 9, 8, 7, 4, 3, 2, number 3, jump." And with that, number 3 and his unwilling passenger leapt toward the center of the wide-open portal in the sky. As they were facing upward, Lucas could see the massive ship receding into the distance. Fear and terror were mixed with awe as he took in the sight of the roughly triangular craft, but with curved sides. Along each side were 2 sets of short nacelles, which must have worked in pairs. That was all he could comprehend at the moment. The underside of the ship started to glow electric blue, and he felt his stomach tingling. The blue of the ship seemed to come together in a beam that stretched down and around number 3. He saw the shrinking of the ship had slowed, but felt no forces on himself. Then it stopped, and the ship no longer receded from his perspective, but began to grow again. There was nothing attached to him, however. He felt no forces, but rather he floated there, high above the Atlantic, with a hint of blue plasma about him. Lucas had experienced zero gravity before, as had nearly everyone, but this was a unique experience. He figured he had fallen about 200 meters before he began to bounce back, upward. Kimberly brought their passenger back to about 100 meters below the Faraday. She was feeling rather proud of herself. She hadn't played around with the gravity arrays much, but this was kind of fun. She hadn't realized how versatile their programming could be. Lucas was floating inside a large bubble at the end of a long beam, all formed by the gravity arrays. From a distance, it looked rather like a string of blue honey with a large drop at the end, hanging from the underside of the Faraday. "Okay, Lucas, we're tired of playing around," said Kimberly. "We need to know just exactly what your mission was and what you know." He saw the island below receding and blending into the sea as they moved above the clouds. By this time, Mr. O and the captain had returned to the bridge. Mr. O was getting concerned that his captain might be skating a bit on thin ice as the altitude kept increasing. Their intruder was in a cocoon of temperature and pressure that matched the ship, for now. Even through the faint blue glow, Lucas could see stars clearly now, as well as the curvature of the Earth. Kimberly spied a hypersonic liner on the viewer and eased the Faraday in her direction. Time for some fun. The pilots of these liners had long ago forgone their glass composite canopies and now flew with cameras and sensors alone. The aerodynamic and construction cost was just too great to keep accommodating them. The ones they monitored were usually the forward-looking sets, so they had the illusion of looking through a window and flying the planes themselves. They still had fantastic unions. Passengers, of course, had side-looking cameras, but could call up almost any of a plethora of eyes mounted from tail to wingtip, top or bottom. All of them, including the pilots, were now looking to the starboard side of the hypersonic transport. A very large, strange-looking craft, inside surrounded with faint blue plasma, was moving in the direction of Virgin Galactic Flight 223 from London to Buenos Aires, and there was something dangling from it. As the craft moved toward Flight 223, it moved upward, and they could start to see a bulb at the end of the dangling beam. The hypersonic had rather short, stubby, swept wings, so the craft was quite close before it disappeared above. With these cameras anyway. Lucas could not see the passengers, but he knew they were there. The passengers, of course, could see him perfectly. He seemed to be shouting, but of course they could never hear him. The Faraday moved Lucas inside his bubble alongside of the hyperliner. The passengers kept switching to the camera he might be in front of, as did the crew. The Faraday settled with the bubble about 10 meters above and in front of where the pilots sat. That was it. Lucas had broken and was crying to come back inside. Fun time was over. The passengers and crew of Flight 223 watched as the man in the bubble retracted into the greater blue blur above them. Then the apparition was gone. Before the liner captain could hit the override, several of the passengers had downloaded the aircraft videos for a most interesting souvenir. Number 3 and Lucas were back inside the ship, suspended above the open port, but the doors were closing. They bobbed around inside a bubble that was much larger than it was outside to maintain enough breathable atmosphere until his section of the hold pressurized. Monitoring the two from the bridge, Captain McDonough shut off the internal gravity array, and Number 3 dropped to the floor, his mechanical legs taking up the shock. And standing in the center of the yellow rectangle, the suit indicators and the cameras seemed to show that Lucas had passed out, probably from hysteria. Otherwise, he did not seem the worse for wear, and he should be a bit more pliable for questioning now. She instructed Number 3 to walk back to the break room, following the same path they had taken. Lucas was still out like a light when they returned to break room 2. He jerked himself awake, feeling a little dizzy and disoriented, standing in front of Kimberly and Mr. O. Before we continue, you might want to clean yourself up a bit and get into some fresh clothes, Kimberly said. We left you some in the locker room back there. Go ahead and toss yours into the disposal and get a good shower. We'll wait. Without any effort from Lucas, Number 3 took them into the locker room, with the door closing behind them. The suit released him so he could continue with his ablutions. He took his time trying to figure out a way out of here. But where was here? And what horrors could they think of next? He had no idea who these people were, but they seemed to hold all the cards. They had a proper sense of paranoia, which he could appreciate. Being a spy, he knew what damage spies could do. Gagnon, or whatever his name was, certainly hadn't prepared him for this. He was going to need a lot more credits if he survived. As he dried himself and started dressing, he wondered if he should not just tell them what they wanted to know, and disappeared. What was there to tell anyway? He had been at VLC for months and had learned very little. He started feeling a bit more like himself anyway, as he looked in the mirror and combed his hair. Then he noticed Number 3 in the mirror, standing behind him. As he had his hands up, comb in one hand, styling his hair, the loader clamped onto his forearms like before, then upper arms and all the rest. At least it let him finish with his hair before it motioned for him to put the comb down and take over his hands again. Lucas guessed he was there also to make sure he didn't dawdle. Number 3 walked them over to the break room table and sat down. They were joined by Kimberly and Justin opposite. If I tell you why Gagnon sent me, will you let me go? Pleaded Lucas. Let's just hear what you have to say first, said the captain. Lucas had seen many types in the world. He didn't figure these two for killers, and he would take a shot that they didn't want to be asked a lot of questions themselves. Okay, I guess you could say I'm a spy, a corporate spy. Gagnon gave me this identity and maneuvered me into VLC somehow when they were hiring. I was just supposed to look for dirt, any kind of anomaly, shortcutting, safety violations, or any goings-on that just didn't look on the up and up. To be honest, I hadn't found much of anything at all. I think their competitors just want to bring VLC down. There are a few stories of equipment being ordered to Taha'a, but never showing up anywhere else. So when I saw a lot of heavy equipment and crates being moved into that building, I slipped in and hid amongst the boxes to see if I could find any transfer labels. It felt like I was being lifted on some kind of elevator, but it got dark quietly. It hit me later that no one needs lights in an automated warehouse. Then I figured if you had valuable cargo, there must be a good sensor net watching over it. I could only move around if crew members were close enough to help mask it, and they didn't come down very often. I didn't get very far, as you can probably see in your logs, but I had to find something to eat. Now we are getting somewhere, said the captain. She held up her viewer with a still shot of Levesque and turned it in his direction. Is this your Monsieur Gagnon? That's the guy, said Lucas. Mr. O found a bag of tortilla chips and some sodas. He poured the chips into a bowl and brought them back to the table, pushing them into the center. He slid a soda can over the table to Lucas. Man, I don't know how you survive, knowing the kind of crap some of the crew here eat. The captain was deep in thought. She knew Van Leeuwan would want to hear about this ASAP, but she had to appear as if she weren't agitated by this new knowledge. She knew she probably shouldn't have been showing off with her creative interrogation techniques, but she got the information and the subject was no worse for wear. The only thing she had really hurt was his pride. The ships, of course, had been sighted for a century. The plasma fields around them were never very photogenic. Besides, it was pretty easy to phony up video and had been for a long time. You know, Lucas, I don't think it would be a very good idea for you to see Mr. Gagnon again, or any of his associates, the captain said seriously. I doubt that you still have a job at VLC, but just going there might alert Mr. Gagnon. You're right, I've been reporting to him for months, but there never was anything that struck his fancy. Now when I do have something, I know he will look at me like I'm nuts. Chapter 5. We have met the aliens, and they are us. By now, the video shot from the hyperliner had hit the news and gossip nets. It was all over the Earth, the Moon, Mars, and spreading fast. This was the best video of a UFO shot in 30 years, if that is what it was. The creature next to the spaceplane looked human, but no living thing could handle the near vacuum of the stratosphere and those accelerations. Geeks on the nets would be poring over it for years. But then again, so would several governments. It was a lot more interesting than some odd piece of tinfoil floating in low Earth orbit, or some blobs floating under several kilometers of ice on Europa. Those gelatinous blobs couldn't make fire, and that made them rather dull life forms indeed. Megan had been watching the nets off and on all day, laughing at the blathering of all the experts. She knew Mr. Van Leeuwan had seen it, but she didn't dare bring up the subject. After that luncheon with Lavoisier and Levesque, everyone thought they needed a break. The chances anyone would ever connect VLC with the video were minute. For those in the know, however, it still made them nervous. Megan thought the face in the video looked vaguely familiar, but she hadn't placed it yet. It would come to her. Just to be sure, she told the intelligence people to go over it and see if they could make any kind of identification. Levesque was pacing his small office next to Lavoisier's. It had been days since his agent Georgios Lascaris, a.k.a. Lucas Diamandis, was at the meeting spot. He left messages in the drop box, but there was no sign of him. This wasn't like Georgios, as he had always proved to be very reliable. Either he had found something really fantastic and was pursuing it, or something nasty had happened to him. At this point, he didn't care which. He just had to know, just so he could make plans. Lavoisier had been writing him for months to get some inside information on VLC. He was running for president again and thought that some high-profile prosecutions would look good for the Islanders, which showed how little he understood Islanders. It didn't seem to matter to him that the Van Leeuwan family had achieved the status of near divas here. He just figured that the bigger they were, the harder they would fall, and the higher he would rise. These islands were merely a stepping stone for him. But what to do? A disappearing VLC worker might be just the kind of scandal they were looking for. No one could remember if VLC had ever had an industrial accident or workplace violence. On the other hand, he was one of their agents, and they might not want to draw too much attention to him. If his cover had been blown, then that was a whole different wrinkle. Lavoisier never knew how Levesque gathered his intelligence, but if Georgios were connected to Levesque, it would boomerang back to Lavoisier. This situation was starting to make Levesque's head spin a little, so he didn't notice Lavoisier when he stormed into his office with a viewer in hand. Have you seen this? You've got to see this video, Lavoisier panted. This damn video is going to clog up the nets right up to the election. Anything that took the local spotlight off Lavoisier was always a bad thing. Look at that guy's face. He's scared, sans merde. This is all anyone is going to be talking about for weeks, Lavoisier cried. Levesque had long ago stopped paying attention to the latest media shining objects. Most of it was intentional or unintentional misdirection/misinformation. He knew because he planted several of those stories himself. He was always up for some new and creative techniques to either misdirect or gaslight the public, and this looked interesting. With the blue plasma blur and that strange outfit, there was something familiar about the terrified man in the bubble. Monsieur Lavoisier, could we run this by our forensics people to see if we can get a better ID on this guy? Perhaps we could get better images of the craft, or whatever that thing is above the hyperliner. Good thinking, Levesque. Perhaps I could be the hero in this instead of making someone else the villain, as usual. Go ahead and see what they might come up with. At the very least, perhaps we can identify this gentleman. Somebody might be looking for him. And with that, Levesque called the electronics forensics laboratory and gave them a high priority code to identify the frightened man. He didn't need to send them the video. Everybody had it. But just in case it was doctored, he put in a call to get a verified copy from Virgin Galactic via his British government contacts. He was still there in his office late into the evening, watching that video over and over. He knew he should give up and wait for forensics, but this thing gnawed at him. Trevor Van Leeuwan, of course, knew exactly what he was looking at and getting angrier by the minute. Kimberly was great and he loved her to death, but she was still a hot dog who just had to get it out of her system from time to time. Just last year, she made a high-speed run through the Valles Marineris while playing peekaboo with various colony outposts on the rim or in the lava tubes below. This was just after she was recruited and guessed she should go out and play Han Solo for the day. He gave her a good dressing down, but its effectiveness was questionable because he could not keep the smile off his face. Her runs were so fast and erratic that there was nothing Earth intelligence could hang their hats on. He would have to remember not to smirk this time. The whole relationship between the new system and Earth was, by design, very one-sided. Technology, starting with his grandfather Marcus, had made great leaps starting on Earth and then in the new system that were far beyond Sol's. They had nothing to compare with it yet. The people of Earth, Mars, Titan, and Callisto had no idea that they had brothers and sisters in another star system, and that this had been the case for over a century. Marcus Aurelius Van Leeuwan had invented a hyperdrive based on the bending of space-time. Many had been working on such a thing for 100 years, but either they never came close or the technology was quashed. That debate had never ended. Marcus kept his invention to himself, however. After inventing the hack-proof communications chipsets, he was a multi-billionaire. He now had time and resources to devote to his other true passions in science and engineering. His heroes were the 18th and 19th century self-made scientists who delved into the mysteries of the world around them. The lucky ones had generous patrons, or the independent wealth required to be unhampered by the prevailing winds of government funding. They were not always limping from one grant request to another, hoping that they would have enough meat in their last write-ups to get their funding renewed. Tenure was supposed to keep the creative bubble open, not toss everyone into the same mold. And tenure was more tenuous than one might imagine. Moreover, from the latter 20th century onward, their research had to toe the party line or the latest fad, regardless of its scientific merit or usefulness. Everything was political. Good old Grandpa Marcus Aurelius, like his namesake, was a deep thinker. He loved technology, but was a great student of the human animal. He knew their herding instincts, their fear of standing out or disagreeing with the group. He knew their deep, anxious desire to be liked often outweighed their willingness to say or do the right thing. He knew how quickly and spontaneously their violent hierarchies could be built and how dangerous they were. He knew that people would tolerate the most horrific acts rather than have a confrontation with a so-called authority or even a peer. And he knew that greater technology often brought out the worst sociopaths, thinking only of amplifying their power. If not directly, then through intimidation of the developers. He thought to himself, Why should the tyrants be the only social engineers? Why should there be social engineers at all? This was a once-in-a-millennium chance to flip the great game on its head. After all, he had 5,000 years of history to work with. He figured one can learn from bad examples as well as good. Of course, this would be a road fraught with monumental moral danger. The foundational elements of any new society would need to be as solid as possible. The key element in such a society must be the ability to choose for oneself. So he set about cultivating some founding mothers and fathers who believed as he did, not in everything, but in some vital areas. The astronomers and exobiologists had, by Marcus' time, made a great deal of progress in their exoplanetary surveys. This was the starting point of exploration for him and his small crew. There were plenty of candidates to choose from in the right temperature range for liquid water, with apparent atmospheres and indicated biological activity. There were hundreds, actually, within a reasonable range in their list of possible new homes. Closest to Earth were checked out one by one. This took quite a bit of time at first until more ships, crews, and equipment were assembled. There were many fantastic prospects, but it was decided to stick with those that were closest cousins to Earth in gravity, temperature, pressure, atmosphere, and general types of life forms. Hopefully edible and non-toxic. At the very least, the possibility of Earth agriculture substitutions should be there, i.e. the soil and pests would not destroy them. As it turned out, Earth-like DNA, proteins, and sugars were not uncommon, so it was not terribly difficult to transplant bits of DNA from one to another for the best adaptability. Finally, the colonists settled on a planet they named Magellan. The environment was friendly, and the soil could grow almost any Earth variety. As it turned out, Magellan's pests preferred not to eat them, and the Earth plants could not cross-pollinate with those of the planet. The gravity on Magellan was about 1.4 times that of Earth, so it took some time for colonists to work their muscles up to speed. The older-style exoskeletons were, for the most part, helpful in getting people moving around. Once people were in shape, however, they could handle themselves pretty well, especially back in the Sol system, where a hustler could make some real money. With the increased gravity, the weather there was much less erratic than on Earth. With each trip, the colonists brought satellites and other equipment with them to set up their communications, weather forecasting, and prospecting needs. For the growing villages on the surface, basic tooling and machinery were transplanted in order to bring them up to self-sufficiency at a greater pace. Very few selected to be a new system colonist ever complained of being without the niceties of Earth. These were adventurers who loved the fact that they could build new lives as they saw fit, without the suffocating petty encumbrances of society. Many of the colonists worked for larger entities, but almost all of them had their own enterprise going on the side. There was just too much to do. Those who, for whatever reason, felt they were not going to make it on Magellan would be sent back to Earth or Mars. They had to sign documents stating they would never reveal where they had been or with whom they associated. There were a few who did not abide by their agreements, but they did not get very far with respect to credibility. There were humans at home hiding advanced technologies, but the governments these people believed in were the ones hiding them. The new system definitely benefited from their secrecy and downplaying of sightings. Captain McDonough's latest stunt may have stretched the envelope more than necessary, Trevor thought. Megan had just forwarded her report of the whole incident, including who the intruder's employer might be. He had mixed feelings because the information was valuable, even if the methods were troublesome. He couldn't encourage that sort of behavior for the future. But so much for the heads up. 30 minutes later, Megan alerted him to the news viewer where he saw his old friend Lavoisier giving a press conference. Not a lot of news came out of French Polynesia, so this caught people's attention. The president was enlightening the press on the analysis of that now famous video. It seems their forensics lab, or actually Lavoisier, felt they had a pretty good match for the man outside the hyperliner. He had been identified as one Lucas Diamandis, a resident of French Polynesia, and Taha'a specifically. Lucas, it turned out, was also an employee of Van Leeuwan Corporation. The president let their forensics man go on a while about compensation techniques and Fourier analysis, etc., before he once again took control of the microphone. Inquiries had to be made of his neighbors, and no one had seen him. Calls put into VLC indicate that Monsieur Diamandis has not reported to work for several days, the president said. Of course, an investigation into this matter has already begun. We cannot have our citizens disappearing like this. Our air and sea rescue assets are being deployed as I speak here. Great. Just great. This is all I need, shouted Trevor. Megan, could you come in here, please? Megan came promptly. He called for her when he knew he needed to calm down, and it nearly always did the trick. I scanned Kimberly's report, Megan. Do we still have this Lucas in custody? You could say that, Mr. Van Leeuwan, she replied. They have him occupying a break room on board the Faraday. He's being treated well, for the moment anyway. Trevor thought there must be a way to end this before it even starts. He asked who among them, with top security clearance, was in the plant right now. They needed one or two reliable people to see this thing through. Megan narrowed it down to a few names. Okay, of these people, which ones could we place in a company boat where it wouldn't look that out of place with their normal duties? Any security guys? Megan replied, Yes, we do, sir. It looks like Chief Hannah Wharton and one of her deputies are both on duty. Shall I call them in? Yes, please. We will need to move fast on this one. Get me Captain McDonough on the comms, thank you. Megan went back to her office to get things rolling. In a few minutes, she indicated that Captain McDonough was ready for him. She looked nervous, and he did his best to look stern. He paused for about 10 seconds for effect and could see her squirm a bit. Okay, Kimberly, you know what you did was over the line. Yes, sir, she said. Trevor continued, but we don't have time for all of that right now. We need to work together to protect our operations from prying eyes. By now, you know there are search parties being organized by President Lavoisier and his minions. Here's what I want you to do. You know the Tupai Atoll? Good. Take up a position near there and out of sight as usual. Now, do you have any life vests aboard the Faraday? This should be standard issue. Great. You two need to outfit your boy Lucas, or whatever his name is, for a day out on the water. That means life vest, sunglasses, fanny pack, that sort of thing. Whatever you could scrounge up. We are going to send our boy sailboarding out. Kimberly and Justin didn't know quite what to make of it, but they followed orders. They were in enough trouble already. Aye, aye, sir. Over and out, Kimberly said, and signed off. Chapter 6. Rescued by the Captors. Captain Wharton and her deputy, Sergeant Peter Connors, were told that Mr. Van Leeuwan would see them now. Trevor put away a few papers and got right to the point. It looks like another delicate mission for you two. We can talk about the security breach later, but for now, we have to get the heat off. That new patrol boat you folks just acquired, the Flying Fish, I'm thinking you might need to take her out for a good sea trial, sort of blow the carbon out of it, as they said in the old days. Yes, sir, they said in unison. I'm going to send you to Tupai to rendezvous with the Faraday, out of sight, out of mind, as it were. First, I want you to get one of our sailboards to take with you, and when you get out to sea, where no one can see you, just snap the boom on it before you get to the rendezvous point. Back on the Faraday, Kimberly and Justin had rounded up what they needed, including some really loud bathing trunks and a tropical shirt Justin could not make himself throw away. They put some broken up power bars in their foil packages into the fanny pack and ripped it a bit here and there and gave it a crude repair job. They told Lucas he needed to put all of this stuff on if he never wanted to see either of them again. He hesitated but complied, wondering just what the hell they were planning next. Wharton and Connors were hightailing it to the Tupai Atoll and having a good time doing it. For a secret mission, this wasn't so bad. They were supposed to sit tight on the northern side of an eastern jutting spit of sand on the northeast side of the atoll. This was after dropping the windsurfer 100 yards or so offshore on the opposite side. After a signal from the Faraday, they were to cruise around the tip of the atoll. About half an hour before dropping off Lucas, Justin thought something was missing with this picture. How much more trouble could they be in anyway? He conferred with Captain McDonough, and she reluctantly agreed. Lucas was standing there in his trunks, life vest, and the whole getup. "Now I want you to put these sunglasses on and go into the shower area." He slowly complied, and the door shut behind him. "Hit it, Justin," the captain said, and Justin snapped on the UV lighting. They told the ship's computer to set it for just a mild burn. When Lucas walked out and saw the deep redness on his arms and legs, he said, "I hope I never see either of you bastards again." They motioned for him to walk where they indicated. They had spotted the broken windsurfer floating just where they expected it to be, and now maneuvered the ship over it, with the locked door about 10 yards away. Kimberly unceremoniously made him walk the plank for real this time. Actually, she just kicked him in the ass into the water. Instinctively, he swam toward the wrecked sailboard and grabbed on. Lucas did not have more than 5 minutes to ponder his predicament before a boat came slowly around the point. Then more quickly, once they spotted him. Of course, there was absolutely not another soul around. Wharton and Connors maneuvered the flying fish up close to the wreckage and the survivor. They offered help, but he climbed aboard the ladder under his own power, swearing under his breath. Connors left him there with Wharton as he gathered up the windsurfer with the boat hook. Wharton had to almost force him to drink some water. Even though she knew the underlying plan, she had to make it look good. The same went for Connors. There was a village on the other side of the island. His sunburn would be a good excuse to drop him off there rather than having to take him in themselves. With luck, they would get by with just a few questions from the authorities. Getting Lucas some lotion for his sunburn, she mused. That was some good thinking. Wharton smiled to herself. Lucas was silent as they pulled away to the north again and west to the other side. Connors was on the comms already, reporting to the Coast Guard what had taken place and that they were en route to the village. When they pulled into the dock, an ambulance was already waiting. Amid Lucas' protests, he was loaded onto the gurney and floated up to the ambulance with his new caretakers. "Where do you want to do this?" asked the Coast Guard captain. "How about the beach bar over there?" said Wharton, while leading the way. Captain Laurent Giraud was already happy that the Coast Guard was not going to be leading a fruitless search for the next 3 weeks. Normally, he didn't think much of corporate security. He thought of them just as rent-a-cops. But the VLC people were always professional and had a lot of nice benefits. It was something to consider upon retirement at 45. "So you were taking the flying fish out for a spin, as you Americans say, no?" asked Giraud. "That's right, Captain," Chief Wharton said. "We've had a few of this new model patrol boat for a few weeks, and we wanted to see if it lived up to the advertising. You never know when you might need that extra boost to beat the bad guys, right?" Giraud was thinking. This Chief Wharton was attractive, and so was the flying fish. "I have to admit that we're a bit jealous. We have been trying to requisition some of the new pursuit boats for some time. How does she handle?" Chief Wharton replied, "Oh, she handled quite well, sir. The hydroplanes certainly do help." The captain continued, "So did your passenger say much about how he ended up so far away from Tahaa?" Peter piped. "Is that where he came from? He didn't say anything to us, really. He just groaned a lot, complained about his sunburn." "Yes," Giraud continued, "as far as we know, that is where he came from. The windsurfer has identifying labels from the VLC employee recreation area. You know, a VLC employee went missing sometime last week, and he fits the initial description." "I see," said Chief Wharton. "Well, you know, he probably was not on our radar unless there was a missing persons report. We try our best to attract the best employees, but there's still that mystique of the islands. We do get the odd drifter to drop out here and there." Giraud nodded. It was a problem for his service as well, though the penalties for desertion were a bit more stiff. "Well then," Giraud exclaimed, "we must continue with our investigation for the time being. We will be in touch with you if we need more information or assistance." With that, he saluted, turned on his heels, and walked up to the village infirmary. Wharton and Connors played it cool. They ordered some large iced teas from the bar since they were still on duty. They took in the goings-on of the village for a while. Some Newsnet hovercraft showed up about an hour later, and reporters scrambled toward the infirmary. They weren't likely to get much, either from the Coast Guard or from Lucas. That didn't matter to them. since they were on location and they could always fill the time with conjecture. The VLC security duo thought it was best to get out of Dodge before the reporters figured out who they were. They quietly pulled the flying fish out of the dock, out over the surf, and headed for home. It was calm and peaceful out in the South Pacific, even with the engines roaring and the wakes splashing. Back at the ranch, however, it was raining chaos. Though they pulled in from the ocean side of the campus, they could see the bright and flashing lights near the front entrance. The reporters were here en masse, so they secured the boat and ran to join their brethren on the front lines. Trevor Van Leeuwan was there, and Megan behind him. Reporters were shouting questions, one over the top of the next. Wharton and another chief dove in along with Connors to help direct security and rudimentary crowd control, since it looks like they were short-handed. Mainly they came to carve out and maintain a space for Van Leeuwan and Megan so they would not be trampled. Mr. Van Leeuwan, was Lucas Diamandis an employee of yours? Do you know why he went missing? We're attempting to ascertain his identity along with the local authorities, Trevor said calmly. Of course, we will cooperate with the investigation. I'd just like to say for now that we at VLC are pleased that Mr. Diamandis is receiving the care he needs and is on the road to recovery. Mr. Van Leeuwan, Mr. Diamandis has been going on about some kind of abduction. Any comment? Trevor replied, I don't know anything about that. I understand that he may have been at sea all this time. He may be suffering from heat stroke or some other effects of exposure. We've seen this before with some of the tourists who visit our island. I'm sure that we'll figure out everything in due time. I trust you all will give him some quiet time to recover from his ordeal. Megan signaled to Wharton and his deputy Connors and said, Mr. Van Leeuwan and VLC have nothing further to say at this time. Thank you all for your patience. Security hustled them away from the reporters and back inside the gates of the plant. They quickly boarded a cart and sped off toward the main office building. Lavoisier had been on the news talk nets all day, of course. For the next 2 days, he was the hottest interview on the nets. When he was not on, there were countless experts and commentators speculating on the mysterious video. Not everyone agreed with the Lavoisier analysis that the man in the video was, in fact, Lucas Diamandis. On the alternative media, not everyone agreed that Lucas Diamandis was Lucas Diamandis. Nor did his alleged story of alien abduction jive with all the other stories of alien abduction. How did he explain the sunburn or the fact that he was several kilometers out to sea with a company windsurfer? In his own video appearances with his now famous ambulance-chasing lawyer, Michael Duesenberg, he was hindering his own credibility. Many just thought he was another hustler trying to sue someone with deep pockets. Trevor Van Leeuwan ignored the threats of lawsuits and simply let everyone know that Lucas could continue to live in his company-provided bungalow for another 3 months while he recovered, and remained on administrative leave. He was feeling more confident that his family's and his company's reputation would survive this one. After a week had passed, Lavoisier was getting less and less time in the media. Even his campaign was getting shaky. Connecting one of his citizens with some kind of alien abduction did not make him appear all that stable once the pundits started picking it apart. Moreover, they started digging into Lavoisier's record a lot more deeply than he appreciated. Lavoisier had taken the forensics team to task over the video. They had cautioned him before, but he went off half-cocked, making claims about it. What they danced all around at the press conference was that they were 90% sure Diamandis was the man in the video. They also told him that other forensics teams would likely feel the same way, but would they say so? No. They valued their careers too much. As for the craft behind the blue ionization field, they had nothing to compare it to. After running the video through all kinds of filters and using as many mathematical tricks as they could to massage the images, all they could say was that it was some kind of mechanical construction. There were no markings on it they could identify, or if there were, they were coded somehow. It was a sure bet that Virgin Galactic and the British government were going over the hyperliner sensors in the original video with a fine-tooth comb. Sure enough, Space Command UK was extremely interested in this video. Commander Arthur Kynaston was listening as some young analyst pointed to distorted images from the archives. Video taken from a strange incident 2 years ago in the Valles Marineris showed an anomalous vehicle of comparable scale buzzing the various outposts along the rim. By coincidence, there were strange lights periodically seen from a distance, emanating above the VLC compound. The site was in one of many side canyons along the Valles Marineris. Strange colored lights were reported for several months around that time. This was one of the more remote canyons claimed by Van Leeuwan Corporation, where they were doing some exploratory drilling. They had no near neighbors to speak of. There it was again, another tenuous connection to VLC, but so weak one could never really join them together. Most people had forgotten all about any pale blue anomalies when it was revealed what VLC had been up to out there. After a few years of exploration, reams of gravimeter data, magnetic anomaly data, GPR, and seismic testing, VLC had struck oil on Mars. Everyone just assumed they were looking for water, and that was found too, but oil and gas was a completely different animal. Oil was going to change Mars for hundreds of years. Chapter 7. Prospectors and Mysteries. VLC had been pretty successful prospectors on Earth, but most people thought it was just dumb luck. It wasn't. There was a lot of science, a lot of sweat, and failures along the way, but they never operated by pure chance. Mining into the bottom of the ocean took a lot of development, hard work, and time, but the efforts had paid off and were still paying off. Very late in the game, VLC staked some of the remaining oil claims on Earth that no one was interested in. Oil drilling was not a large part of their business, but it kept their hand in. Trevor's uncle by marriage, Klaus Ebner, had been the chief mining engineer with VLC Earth. He showed his data to the board for the unlikely deposits on Earth, along with the analysis of various Mars sites. The data looked convincing, they had to admit, so in the end, they approved the funds for the Mars exploratory drilling projects. Old Klaus was a believer in the heretical theory that sources for oil and gas were abiotic, i.e. they didn't come from dead dinosaurs or million-year-old decayed plant goo. He felt there were vast amounts of hydrocarbons deep in the more massive rocky planets, just like there was more than the entire Earth's ocean of water deep in the mantle of the Earth. He didn't believe that all of the gravitational sorting out had finished, and that all the lighter molecules were at the surface. There was still a fortune in valuable materials locked into the rock. Of course, VLC had staked out as many Mars claims as the association allowed. No one was interested in claims for water or anything else so far from the settlements. Purifying such salty water was expensive enough, so hauling it was not in the cards. No one in their right mind, as far as the thinking at the time, would be looking for oil where nothing grew or ever had grown. Oil on Mars would be worth more than platinum, copper, or titanium. The problem with the Mars colonies was that fuel was still scarce for a reaction engine based on combustion, but Mars still had an appreciable gravity well. The best thing available is hydrogen after separating the hydrogen from the oxygen in water. Hauling fuel all the way from Earth or Titan and setting it back down on the surface was costly. The rockets may have been reusable, but the fuel was damned expensive. Tankers still exploded when landing generous cargoes of fuel, and that put a lot of colonists off. Oxygen from perchlorates or CO2 could be processed from materials at or near the surface. With oil available, there would be plenty of hydrogen, methane, kerosene, or anything else that might be required to burn with liquid oxygen or perchlorate. Perchlorate was toxic, so nobody wanted it around in any case, and had to be separated from the regolith for anything edible to grow in it. Decontaminated dust was a nice byproduct to sell to the colonists. Nobody cared about strange lights. What people cared about were the vast numbers of jobs opening up to build the first oil rigs, refinery, and pipelines on Mars. Commander Kynaston recalled the exclamations that Mars would be the new Alaska, and that the rush was on. He had a deep grudge against VLC, though he knew there was no rightful reason to feel that way. He knew they played the game fair and square, but that is exactly what rankled him. Something about them went against his independent school or English sense of fair play. Yes, they played the game fair and square, but this was just too much winning. That much winning should only be possible for the right sort of people. Now Space Command UK, the American Space Force, and everyone else public and private on Mars, would have to start buying their fuel from VLC or drill their own wells. The fact that their fuel would be vastly cheaper and safer than it was now didn't seem to register with him. He still thought like a government worker. Just once, he would like to catch them at something. But did they have anything to do with the strange lights on Mars or people being abducted on Earth? He would be drummed right out of the service for starting down that road. He told his forensics and intelligence analysts to write up their findings, but to leave the file open. He reckoned he would start asking questions quietly of his intelligence contacts in the other branches and around the world. Surely he was not the only one who was suspicious. He thought about the goings-on in French Polynesia and the upcoming conference in Berlin. Perhaps that publicity-seeking president would be there. A few discreet calls would let him know. Levesque had been leading the investigation into Lucas Diamantis' disappearance for days now. As Van Leeuwan had said, the company was cooperating in every reasonable way. At least 100 man-hours, plus another 10 computer hours, have been spent scanning security videos for any possible leads. Another 30 employees had been questioned. All communications to and from Lucas' personal devices had stopped at 4:17 that Tuesday afternoon inside the main cargo loading area for VLC and never returned. Of course, he had to hire someone so good that he was not detected by anyone else when going into the unauthorized areas of the plant. The same went for the windsurfer. It was not one of the ones stored in the rack outside the beach concession. It had to be one from the repair sheds that was out of circulation. It was time to go pay Georgios a visit. After badging his way into VLC, Levesque floated over to the employee bungalows to get some alone time with Georgios, a.k.a. Lucas. Shouting bonjour at the doorway, he let himself in. Georgios was half asleep on the hammock in the rear and was rudely aroused by Levesque giving him a shove. "I see you survived your ordeal pretty well, Georgios," said Levesque. "Well, sir, it wasn't exactly a spring break vacation, despite what the newsnets are telling you. Now I'm blown and I can never do this kind of work again. My face has been splashed all over the solar system. You know what that means, don't you? My golden parachute kicks in now. That's when my holiday starts." Georgios was fixing himself a margarita, though it was only 1 o'clock in the afternoon. "Would you like one, Monsieur Levesque?" Sure, I think I need one after the last few days. So I came to get your story from the beginning, now that we could speak." Georgios handed Levesque his drink, and they both sat down in the high-backed chairs on the back porch. Levesque relayed what had happened in the official investigation, but they were both still stumped. "We've taken the computer artist composites for your descriptions of the captain and first officer. We have only 2 facial recognition matches for the first officer, and neither has more than 75% probability. For the captain, we have 6 matches and 1 with 90% probability for our database. The interesting thing is that 3 of the matches are related to each other, including the 90% match. That matches to a Starliner pilot by the name of Kimberly McDonough, who went missing over 2 years ago. We are trying to get her personnel records right now, but are running into a few snags over privacy laws, etc. Her remaining family members are fighting us in court. Officially, she is dead, but there are right to disappear laws that might apply. You said they both spoke English and that the few signs you saw were in English. Well, this McDonough was from the States, Arizona, je pense." Georgios gave a long sip on his margarita and sat back again. "You know, when they blasted me with that ultraviolet, then threw me in the ocean, it pretty well destroyed even any DNA evidence I might have taken with me. I have to admit, they were good. And yeah, they were as human as you or I." Levesque also took a long swig of his drink. "Right now, we are going into any public records we could find and starting to interview other people who knew her. We've managed to talk to a couple of classmates and a roommate or 2, so we can get a crude psychological profile. She's been described as a risk-taker and sometimes show-off. That would be consistent with what you told me and consistent with her disappearance." "That is very interesting, Monsieur Levesque. Just how did this Captain McDonough disappear?" "She had beaucoup vacation time built up, so she decided to take one of those adventure trips. She signed up for this excursion to the surface of Enceladus to see the geysers. I guess Yellowstone Park was just too boring for her, no?" "So it was. Her party had a camp near the geysers in the south. One day, when they were exploring, they looked back and she was gone. She was the last to be attached to the lifeline that they shared, but she was no longer connected. They searched in vain, but their oxygen was, alas, too low. It was believed that she may have fallen into one of the treacherous crevasses there, Georgios injected. The woman who took me for a ride looked very much alive to me. She was no popsicle, and she did not appear to have any long-standing injuries. Levesque continued, I'm just getting to the most curious part, my dear Georgios. The name of the company running the tour was called Off-World Adventures, a subsidiary of Solar Plane Tours, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Van Leeuwan Corporation. I'm ready for another margarita now, monsieur. Though it appeared to Trevor that the official investigations had died down, he knew better. The underground investigation, he was sure, had barely started. No one likes to work with people looking over their shoulder, especially governments. Van Leeuwan Corporation could not have stayed in business for over 100 years without developing their own intelligence sources, and those sources were beginning to relay a big heads-up to headquarters. Oceania was talking to France. France was really Franco-Germany. Germany was talking to the UK, and the UK was talking to America, and that was just for starters. Of course, all were making inquiries to their prime, highly subsidized contractors with whom they selectively shared information. Just about all of them would be at the big summit in Berlin this coming week. Trevor had a standing invitation to the conference, but he had never gone before. He didn't like the company there. He wondered what the scuttlebutt would be if he showed up this year. He wondered if his tuxedo still fit. He had Megan book him passage and make sure the company apartment was available, since he was going to be on Earth for a while. He gave instructions for the Faraday to go ahead and ferry some of their cargo, earmarked for one of their mines in the asteroid belt, and load some more of that extremely pure ore. The side trip would keep them busy. Out of sight was out of mind. Chapter 8. Social occasions are only warfare concealed. Trevor arrived in Berlin, unlike so many other attendees of the conference, without an entourage. He was usually out of the limelight, but last week's show made him somewhat recognizable. A company driver was waiting for him at the transportation hub and loaded his luggage into the boot of the limousine. The driver was professional, quiet, and quick, so they managed to get through the hub without being molested by press or autograph seekers. The news nets were looking for the really big fish, presidents, CEOs, prime ministers, or other dignitaries the public could not get enough of. As they sped away toward the apartment, Trevor smiled to himself. The self-deluding press and politicians always referred to this excursion as the Berlin Conference. In actuality, the meeting site was in Wannsee, but the Wannsee Conference had a bad ring to it. Alternative media, who had a greater reputation for accuracy, used that moniker precisely because of the implications. The apartment had the added advantage of not being in the direct line of fire for reporters or other attendees. Newly elected presidents, gregarious politicians, and recently promoted generals all liked to bask in their own self-importance by staying in the main hotel for the conference. They wanted their selfie images zipping around the solar system to include people of equal or greater importance. The hotel was prime trolling ground for photo ops. Van Leeuwan had a couple of drinks the way he preferred them, took a short nap, and dressed for the pre-dinner cocktail hour at the hotel. This would be his first chance to take stock of the attendees, though the really big kahunas would probably skip this part and the welcoming banquet. He wasn't interested in them. His interest was in the less famous staffers and cabinet ministers who might have real information and who still thought they had a chance at working for VLC one day. The company never recruited these guys, but the younger ones did not know that. When Van Leeuwan arrived, thankfully, he was largely missed by the reporters. He encountered only a handful at the entrance. Anticipating their questions, he told them that as far as he knew, the investigation was ongoing. The investigation, such as it was, had largely stalled as far as the public was concerned. This was the same old runaround from government: deny, delay, and forget. Reporters had been barred from the inside of the banquet area, and that was a blessing. He would be grilled more heavily inside, though the manner would be much more subtle. The first attendee to snare him was the Australian military attaché to Berlin. Major General Jiemba Campbell was affable and low-key. He was serious about his job, but friendly and easy to talk to. Trevor had met him a couple of years ago at a symposium in Fiji. This man had plenty of information if one could pry it out of him, and was much better at prying it out of others. He was good at his job. They shook hands and exchanged greetings. "Please call me Jiemba," said the general. "Call me Trevor," said Van Leeuwan. The general had only been away from Earth on short rotations through his career, but had an intense interest in off-world activities and politics. "So how are your Mars operations going, Trevor? What is the status of your pipelines and refinery? I must say I was as shocked as anyone over your wonderful discovery." Trevor told him, "Well, so far so good. We've had a feeling for some time that a well was going to pay off sooner or later. In parallel, our engineers have been working on a modular design for the refinery and a system for piping the crude oil in and the finished products out to where they are needed. We had to analyze just what we're pulling up in order to finalize the hardware. I don't anticipate too many snags in getting the rights of way, but only in the government sectors, no offense. That could be the long pole in the tent. We can, of course, tanker the initial product to the frontier and the new settlements. If people see we are successful in using our own product, that should be a great selling point. Our internal timeline brings us at production in the next few months." "That's much faster than I would have expected, considering you are doing construction in pressure suits. But it is great news. It will be a game changer, to be sure." The general exhibited a genuine boyish excitement as he spoke. He must have been passed over for the additional space duty that he really wanted. Trevor was happy to have the additional business, and the colonists would be ecstatic. Then the general said, "But if you are successful, VLC will have a virtual monopoly on the Mars fuel supply." There it was, thought Trevor, the inevitable punishment for success. "That's one way to look at it, Jiemba, but nothing lasts forever. I should think that the crushing cost of fuel and lowering the loss of life should be something of a bargain. You know, in the 19th century, refining kerosene was extremely hazardous at first, not to mention the fact that sperm whales were rapidly going extinct for the harvesting of them for lamp oil. The distillation equipment was often prone to exploding, as was the finished product in the customer's home. Rockefeller made the process significantly safer by standardizing it, thus the name Standard Oil. Now, along the way, he did a lot of nefarious things like stealing people's patents and strong-arming the pipelines. No one can forgive that. The irony is that by breaking up the company, the individual branches made far more money for their prime shareholders, who were still the Rockefellers. On top of that, there were fewer oil companies around at the end of the 20th century than when Standard was broken up." Trevor would not normally go on in a setting like this, but it appeared that Jiemba was actually listening. Most government types were just waiting to talk over you, so this was refreshing. "End of sermon," smiled Trevor. No, that's quite all right. We in the military tend to get stuck in the rut of defending the thing that is there, not the thing that might be. Space is vast, far greater than we would like to contemplate. Mars is an entire planet on which we have only a tenuous foothold. Others can drill for oil, and then fuel will be even cheaper still. Now that the general was in a philosophical mood, Trevor added, "In any case, military operations in space must have offered up all kinds of insights by now." Of course, the military had been involved in space from the very beginning. Airplanes were not commercially successful for some time, and only government orders and contracts kept the development going. The A-4 was designed as a weapon before it did anything useful. Half or more of the short-lived space shuttle flights were classified military. Unfortunately, I had not logged as much time in space as I would have preferred. Maybe they think I am too good at this kind of work, so I am being punished for my success by getting more of it assigned. The general sighed. Trevor tried again. "There must be a good selection of off-world postings for you to choose from." He noticed the British commander in the nearby group, not so subtly craning to listen to their conversation. He was now breaking away from his group and walking over to join them. "Hello, General Campbell. It's nice to see you again," Commander Arthur Kynaston said as he saluted. "It is a pleasure to see you again as well, Commander. Let me introduce you to Mr. Trevor Van Leeuwan." Trevor held out his hand, and the commander shook it rather more firmly than needed. "I am Commander Arthur Kynaston, at your service," Trevor said. "So you and the general are acquaintances?" "Yes," replied the commander. "We last saw each other in New Zealand, was it, General? We're part of the Commonwealth and all that, you know. And you are in that neighborhood, are you not? Tahiti, is it?" "Not exactly, but close," Trevor replied. "We are in many places, but our headquarters are in Taha. Yes, I've been intrigued by your company for some time, you know." "What was that business last week with the little green men?" smiled the commander. Trevor strained a smile. Yes, well, perhaps if I had met you sooner, you could have advised me. The Space Command must have their fair share of dealings with their kind. Commander Kynaston was not sure if that was sarcasm or just innocent humor. Trevor, trying to change the subject, continued. I was just remarking to the General that there must be many postings to choose from. I believe he has a space bug that has not been satisfied yet. Commander Kynaston went on. Well, I'm sure I have not told General Campbell my most interesting space adventures. We all have them, but of course we are not able to speak freely about everything. I bet that you have some tales to tell yourself, Mr. Van Leeuwan. Your company always seems to be pushing the envelope, as the Americans say. Trevor looked thoughtful. I know exactly what you mean, Commander. It is unfortunate that neither of us is able to share our full knowledge. We never get to find out what the governments are doing until a century has passed, and there are many things we will never know about. Then again, we have our trade secrets and our own compartmentalization. This was a rather odd dynamic to observe between two men who had never met, thought General Campbell. He wondered where the hostility was coming from. He called the waitress over, and they all took a glass of champagne. Gentlemen, let's drink a toast. To new friends, and to the wonders of space. The three of them touched their glasses together. Kynaston and Van Leeuwan each drank, eyes locked on each other over the tops of their flutes. The commander pretended to see someone he knew across the room. Gentlemen, I attend so few of these events. I must make my rounds. General, when I come across any interesting exercises, I shall be sure to recommend you to be present as an observer. We all need to keep our space legs tip-top. Cheerio. After Commander Kynaston left, the General asked Trevor, So what do you think of the commander, Trevor? Well, Jiemba, he seems like he would be a very stiff competitor. Maybe it is best that he stays in the Space Command. He laughed a bit forcefully. But I imagine that is part of what it takes to be successful in the military. He must be in it to win it. There are similar types in business, but there is a large group that just takes pride in satisfying the customer and maintaining a workforce with a healthy attitude. There are a lot of agendas in the military, this is also true, replied the General. Sometimes it is difficult to work through them or around them. I joined for Australia, and I suppose I joined in order to find something more adventurous to do. It is still one of the better paths on Earth, if that is what you're looking for. Perhaps Mars is a little better for an individualist, but it seems we are packing all of our hang-ups and taking them over there as well. Trevor was thinking this was getting pretty deep compared to the usual cocktail party conversation. He liked Jiemba, but had to remember that this man was also in the intelligence business, so one had to be careful. So if you can tell me, without having to kill me, just how far afield do you folks roam ahead of the maddening crowd, without any potential enemies to fight, at least external enemies? It must be difficult sometimes to get motivated. Jiemba replied, As we said earlier, space is very big, and essentially infinite territory encompasses a high probability of real threats. I'm sure it is no surprise to you that we have seen many things for which we have no explanation. Your company has had, and may still have, more remote outposts than any military. You have fewer people to answer to. Van Leeuwan wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but he thought he should ride it out. This is true. The whole question of jurisdiction is subjective, if looked at objectively. By beginning a mining operation on a distant asteroid, how does that fall under anyone's jurisdiction but our own? Are any Earth forces there guarding it? Did we ever ask them to? No. We defended ourselves. In fact, we could be mining 27 different asteroids right now, and there's no need to tell you about any of them, if we were not encroaching on your basic rights. The General had a horrified but intrigued look on his face, if that was possible. Trevor could tell that such a thought had never been presented to him before. There was always a prime minister, an admiral, a governor, who had the final say, wasn't there? Everyone takes orders, don't they? General Jiemba Campbell was still processing. I don't know about that, Trevor. What if an Earth or Mars ship comes across one of your operations? Van Leeuwan replied. What if it did? How would that change the situation in any way from before the discovery? Are they all of a sudden going to impose their rules and alleged protection on our asteroid and us? More and more perplexed, the General just said, Of course, that's just how it works. Trevor continued. So one day we are running our own affairs, and the next day we are subject to a planet-side government? What facts do you rely on to make such a conclusion? Well, that's the way it has always been. The government has the battle cruisers, the personnel, the courts. Jiemba said, though he was looking less sure of himself. You are an intelligent man, Jiemba, Van Leeuwan went on. You have to remind yourself of what you have been told all your life. Government has a duty of protection in return for a duty of allegiance. Government exists through the consent of the governed. How does the government force that duty of allegiance without someone's consent? How does the government force a service, namely protection, on the citizen without consent? Even more, how does the government do this while at the same time insisting it does not have a duty of protection? How can governments claim sovereign immunity, making them exempt from the rules we all have to live by? I believe that if VLC Earth forced you to buy our products or services by holding a gun to your head until you paid, then we would rightfully be called criminals, eh? I'm sure you would never, in your right mind, sign a contract under those circumstances. Head spinning now, General Campbell didn't know if it was the champagne, the late-night hour of the dinner, or his conversation that was responsible. At any rate, he was saved by the MC for the banquet welcoming all of the guests over the PA system. They said their hasty goodbyes as they moved into the main hall to their assigned seating. Trevor wondered if he had actually planted some seeds of doubt with the general. He certainly hoped so. He always thought he said too much at these galas. That's another reason why he avoided them. He was seated next to a Saudi minister and opposite a military contractor. Ali Hijazi, education minister from Saudi Arabia, offered his dining companion to his immediate left. Trevor Van Leeuwan, pleased to meet you. He bowed slightly. Jane Sanderson from Berkeley Armaments, offered the stylish woman in the red gown across the table. Trevor Van Leeuwan from Van Leeuwan Corporation, he replied as he shook her hand. Others filed in and introduced themselves as well. The Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, Ajith Ramachandran, Otto Schenk, a banker from Switzerland, and Newsnet anchor from the Netherlands, Ilse Hoedkoper, all took their seats at the table. The waiters brought Trevor his Cornish hen, poured him a glass of wine, and waited as everyone was served. He wondered how the conversation would be guided. It was a pretty mixed group here. Ms. Hoedkoper looked like a kid in a candy store. She could get some very good stories from this group, though she suspected most of it would be off the record. She started with, Mr. Hijazi, congratulations on your recent appointment. Startled to attention, he stared briefly at her place card and replied, Thank you, Miss Hoedkoper. I hope to do the position honor. She followed up with, This is your first position in government, is it not? That is correct, Miss Hoedkoper. Most of my career has been with the family business, Hijazi Growers, but they are doing well, so it was time to give back a little. Jane Sanderson broke in, I apologize, but am I the only one who is not familiar with that company? The banker answered, If you spend most of your time Earthside, you might not be familiar with it. Though too humble to say so himself, one might say that Mr. Hijazi here is the pineapple king of the Arabian Peninsula. Most of their product is exported to the Mars colonies, including pineapples, coffee, sugar, bananas, and other tropical delicacies. Van Leeuwan interjected, We have sold several freighters to Hijazi Growers. I trust they are all working out well for you, Minister? No problems with them at all, sir. They have proven very reliable and very low maintenance. The minister was obviously more comfortable talking about shipping than he was about education. Jane Sanderson saw her cue. VLC has a wonderful reputation in shipbuilding. Of course, we would prefer that they stay with their civilian contracts. They might prove to be too much competition for us if they enter the military market. Of course, Mr. Van Leeuwan, your company is always full of surprises. You could be planning to scoop us any day now. Trevor replied, Miss Sanderson, I believe I can truly say that we are not in competition with Berkeley Arms. In fact, we cannot even be considered a customer, despite the handful of times we tried to make a purchase. The conversation had taken a serious turn, though only Jane and Trevor knew it. Miss Hoedkoper joined in. I'm not following, Mr. Van Leeuwan. Are you saying that VLC tried to make purchases from Berkeley Arms and they turned you down? That's exactly what I'm saying, returned Trevor. You are aware, Ilse, if I may call you that, VLC has operations quite distant from any military or law enforcement posts. Ilse is fine. Please continue, she said. Trevor nodded and kept going. Some of our shipments can be very enticing for pirates. Yes, there are still pirates, and they are extremely well armed. Yet, as a civilian operation, we are not allowed to buy comparable arms to protect ourselves. In fact, no ship other than a warship is allowed to be armed, period, unless it operates only on the frontier. I'm surprised Miss Sanderson's company would not be lobbying Earth and Mars to get the laws changed. Now that I think about it, perhaps VLC should begin an arms development program outside of the claimed space lanes. Earth has no jurisdiction there. Ilsa Hootcooper had her first good story from this conference. Has VLC been robbed or hijacked in the past, Mr. Van Leeuwan? Ilsa inquired. Several times, but it does no good when we report it. Though the reports are mandatory for our insurance, the civilian investigations are a sham, not even recognized by the insurance companies. Fortunately, none of our people have been killed or injured yet, but our ships and cargoes have been taken only to have the crews dumped into life pods and shot into the inner solar system. Prime Minister Ramachandran asked, "So why do you do it? Why do you maintain operations in such far-off places?" "That's a very good question, Prime Minister, and I will tell you. We do it for the money." Now, I've said that in the crassest way one could put it, but let me follow up. We believe the risk is worth it because we recognize it as a means to higher ends. The capital we gain allows us to fund the more costly research or exploration we do in medicine, or our recent Martian oil and gas discoveries, with plenty to go around, to our charities, or for our employees to ride out the business cycles. We are still a private company, so we need to support our own R&D efforts. Hundreds of years ago, that is how it was done, and we like the freedom it brings us. Trevor realized that everyone at the table had stopped eating and was just following his latest speech. That was not the reason he came here, he had to remind himself. He came to gather information. He smiled and tried to change the subject. "So, Minister Hijazi, I will get off my soapbox now. What are your plans as Education Minister? I'm sure you can bring some much-needed real-world experience to that position." The rest of the table was probably glad to go back to the more mundane dinner conversation. He caught the eye of Jane Sanderson periodically. He could almost hear the cogs turning in her head. That bit about VLC potentially going into the arms business, no doubt, had set her back on her high heels. Surely everything said at this table has already been transmitted back to a Berkeley boardroom. He wondered how often their dealings were black market, or how many of the Berkeley arms shipments were given government escort. For that matter, how much strategic material hijacked from VLC ended up in Berkeley arms or competitors' critical systems. At any rate, it looked like the dinner was wrapping up. The obligatory self-congratulatory toasts were being made from the dais. Chapter 9. The Wannsee Conference. Earlier in the day, Trevor received a call from Dieter Hoffman at OHB SE, and they decided to meet for a drink in a setting away from the conference hotel. Dieter was actually Van Leeuwan's man in Germany. They decided on a hole in the wall closer to the center of Berlin called Clausewitz Biergarten. In a city this size and this far from the hotel, they had a decent guarantee of privacy with respect to the other attendees. And despite the trend, this bar was not outfitted with the usual public video links. He spotted Dieter and pointed to a booth in the rear, where he proceeded to remove his overcoat and hat. Herr Hoffman ordered 2 large lagers at the bar and brought them over. The Clausewitz was a neighborhood bar, dark, the kind where the patrons were not big on eavesdropping and selfies. "So how was the banquet, Mr. Van Leeuwan? I believe this is your first time here in a few years." "The chatter among the usual suspects is already buzzing," said Hoffman. "Yes, I can just imagine. My problem, Dieter, is that I usually avoid this crowd. So when I do get around them, I let them know what I really think. They are so unused to unique opinions themselves that I'm not surprised that my lectures are a great source of gossip. I really must learn to curb my enthusiasm." Trevor half smiled and took a long sip. "Well, from what I have been hearing through the grapevine, is that attention to VLC and yourself has been stepped up in the intelligence community and among their contractor friends." Trevor, looking a bit more serious now, replied, "Yes, so I've noticed. We've had a few close scrapes lately, and that has not helped matters." Dieter took a long sip of his lager and sat back. "Well, Trevor, I would not presume to repeat any of the standard advice. All I could do is keep you informed as best I can. We've done a lot of good business together, and I know you are always straight with me, so I will just lay it out there." Trevor thought, "Okay, now here it comes, and it's going to be good. You have heard about the legislation, right? From what I have gathered, it looks like they are really going to do it this time, only it's worse than we imagined." Trevor never thought they would have the chutzpah to do it. There had been threats for years and bureaucratic demands over customs and mining rights. This was yet another, albeit grandiose, case of one's reach exceeding one's grasp. The plan was to create a multi-party treaty so that governments could take control of the rest of the Sol system. All resources before they were ever harvested would be subject to Earth-Mars regulations, permits, and duties. So what is the plan now, Dieter? Today the Sol system, tomorrow the Milky Way? Trevor said in a half-serious but half-facetious manner. Dieter, still being somewhat sensitive to such humor, continued. It's bad, Trevor. I haven't managed to get my hands on any of the text, but they are talking of claiming everything in the Edgeworth-Kuiper belt as well. Plan is to do it late some Friday night near the end of the year. All of the big defense and civilian contractors are involved. Earthside prospectors and plenty of politicians are in on it, along with the stock manipulators. VLC and a handful of like-minded companies are just in the way, according to my sources. They both sat quietly for a few minutes while Van Leeuwan digested the news. Even Dieter did not know how much of the asteroid belt had been mapped and prospected by VLC, close to 50% by his last reckoning. Earth-Mars survey ships had barely looked at 5% of it, and not counting VLC, were only mining 1% of it. That certainly did not mean the intention of VLC was to claim and mine the whole belt, but it would be nice to have a little payback for the original effort. Really, the idea that most short-sighted people on either planet in this system could rationally claim jurisdiction over places they had never been to or never knew existed. They were claiming control over all possible resources so they could dole them out to their special friends. Now he understood why Miss Jane Sanderson's face turned a little white when he suggested going into the arms business. And they were, VLC and a few other companies who just didn't think the right way. It's sad, Dieter. It's sad that people should be controlled by fools like that and even invite that control on themselves. They are so quickly bamboozled again by the dog and pony shows in the media, Trevor lamented. I know what you mean. Usually, when a crisis hits, we see the government bureaucracies fumbling about over an issue they should have long had plans to address. The worst problems, like the Great Mars Blight, were not solved by the powers that be. It was SpaceX and Blue Origin that kept the food shipments moving for a full year to save those colonists. The majority of history books the kids use these days would not give more than a paragraph to cover that simple fact, Trevor steamed. If the colonists had not been saved, then Mars settlement would have been dead in the water for another 50 years. Dieter brought him back to the present. So you likely would be approached by a lot of people at this conference trying to butter you up. You will be very popular. Trevor understood perfectly well. Everything would go a lot more smoothly if VLC and others could be co-opted into the scheme. Popular is right. Caesar was very popular right up to the moment he was stabbed to death in front of the Senate. Note to self, watch friends as well as enemies. The conversation moved on as Trevor provided Herr Hoffman with the satellite data he had requested. Per their agreement, the only information provided were the self-test and performance logs from the satellites, along with a collection of images of their exterior surfaces. There was nothing there to give away the fact that they were orbiting a planet in another solar system. OBE was well used to this. They knew that many of their satellites were orbiting some of the larger asteroids in the belt, or were out there acting as relays between unknown mining operations. If there was ever a problem VLC could not solve, they would recover the satellite and bring it right into the OBE shop. Hoffman seemed delighted that they were performing so well. For new models, there were surprisingly few glitches. With that, each said Gute Nacht as they went their separate ways. It was a weird sort of jet lag one felt when traveling halfway around the world in only 3 hours. Trevor thought he would just stay up, but then forced himself to sleep a while so he could adjust. If Van Leeuwan didn't have to corner any of these people, he would have attended only the talks he was interested in via video link. Now the shoe was on the other foot. He was the one to be cornered in this arena. After a leisurely breakfast in the apartment, he called the driver to take him to the conference. Berlin was jammed with surface and air vehicles today, but they had allowed time to get across the city. Once on the main thoroughfares, it seemed that several vehicles had slowed down or sped up to match their velocity. There were so many cameras in the city and ingrained in the vehicles, there would be no problem tracking him, so why would he be followed? Perhaps it was just his imagination after last night's conversation, or he had seen too many movies. He would have to shelve that little paranoid fantasy for later. It was time to hobnob with the elite once more. The keynote address was given by a Nobel laureate in medicine, Dr. Izumi Hashimoto. She had beaten out some VLC scientists a few years ago for her work in maintaining bone density and muscle integrity in low gravity. Her delivery was soft-spoken and it gave a very uplifting speech, but not so long-winded as most. Trevor thumbed through the conference materials once more while he listened. There were some vendors who had some new habitation and work pods he needed to check out. This afternoon there were 2 symposiums on the latest propulsion developments and one on shipbuilding. That should round out day 1 well enough. The opening ceremonies broke up, and Van Leeuwan wandered downstairs to the vendor exhibition. Just to be different this time, he'd started in the defense systems section, though he knew there was little they would sell to him. There had not been a major military clash for 100 years on Earth or on Mars, yet here they were, still hard at it. It was good to know what they were up to in public as well as in secret. Trevor had his own security in a one-sided Cold War with these idiots, and had been for years. With the legislation a possibility, he knew he needed to pay a little more attention to developments. New system ships could track the very best Earth-Mars starships without them being the wiser. The Sol system ships were getting bigger and more powerful. They carried some wicked railguns, and even their directed energy weapons were not to be sneered at. Without extraordinary measures, a mining colony was completely defenseless. The threat to VLC operations was a real one, unless new system ships and technology came in to defend it. VLC relied on several passive defense measures, such as creating multiple ghost images or jamming of their scanners. The sources were well concealed and had never been discovered. Berkeley Arms had one of the biggest booths, as always. They displayed everything from pistols, armored pressure suits, and communications systems to looping videos on giant screens of their space planes, interplanetary ships, and orbiting substations. Outside there was an area set aside for a demonstration of their newest railguns and energy weapons. The European Defense Consortium had a large booth alongside that of the Chinese and Australian displays. Jane Sanderson was there, dressed to the nines, schmoozing what looked to be well-dressed Russians and a couple of Turks. It looked like she spotted him and waved him over. Normally he would point at his watch and feign being in a hurry, but he figured it was now or never. Trevor pretended to look at some of the brochures as she finished with those 2 gentlemen. When they were finished, she motioned for him to come to the rear cubicle where the deals were discussed with potential customers. "I was hoping to run into you again, Mr. Van Leeuwan. I wanted to talk to you again, away from the festivities," she said, smiling. "Our conversation last evening has got me thinking. Berkeley Arms has a hospitality suite here in the hotel. I would like to invite you to pay us a visit this evening, say around 8 p.m. I promise the guests will be of great interest to you," Trevor replied. "Of that I am sure. This conference always attracts a rather eclectic crowd. I believe I will be available this evening, so I will accept your invitation. Tell me, what suite will you be in?" Jane beamed. "That would be suite 1527. I hope to see you there." They shook hands, and Van Leeuwan wound his way through the crowds to see what products he could see. VLC was a fish they had attempted to reel in for some time. There were always subtle hints about being invited to play with the big boys. They had always wriggled off the line before, right when the net was coming down. Trevor figured the time had come when the invitations were to be far less subtle and would become far more like threats. There had been many hints and offers in the past for government/military contracts in shipbuilding, boring equipment, utility vehicles, and even weapons under subcontract. VLC sold them minor off-the-shelf items from their product catalog, or even the occasional ore shipment. Never in the entire existence of the company did they enter into a government contract. Similarly, even during the roughest times, not one credit in subsidies did the company take. That's why their rainy day fund was so massive. Grandpa Marcus knew that government money was the slippery slope to losing control of the company. He would rather fold up the tent and liquidate the assets than submit to ever more intrusive regulations. The rest of the afternoon was fairly mundane. There were a few interesting talks and some novel products, so Trevor kept the literature at least. He decided to drop in with the folks at the VLC booth and grab some dinner with them before venturing upstairs. According to his sales and marketing people, they had been quite busy from the opening hour of the show. There were several potential prospects thus far. He said his goodbyes and made his way into the lobby and toward the elevators. One elevator had been reserved for Berkeley Arms. It looked like they were going all out for this conference. The elevator stopped at the 8th floor, and in walked Commander Kynaston with an aide. They each said a friendly hello, but the elevator was rapidly filling up. Finally, they arrived at the 15th floor, and he just followed the rest of the herd to the hospitality suite. Of course, the suite was one of the largest in the hotel, primarily used for just this purpose. The room was all in white, setting off the dark suits and gowns of the attendees. The sofas, chairs, carpet, and curtains were all white and properly stain resistant. A lot of wine was spilled in his room. It was close to 9, so the room was filling up. Trevor recognized the American ambassador across the room, Dietrich, if he remembered correctly. Then there was Jane Sanderson working the crowd. Kynaston was off with the Australian, Campbell again, and some other Commonwealth members. And of course Lavoisier was across the room with his own crowd, gesticulating wildly as he told him another tall tale. Trevor made his way to the bar, where he ordered a nice single malt scotch and could observe the crowd for a few minutes. Everything looked pretty normal so far for one of these functions. Conan Dietrich, the U.S. ambassador to Germany, made his way to the bar as if he didn't know who Van Leeuwan was, and ordered a brandy while standing next to Trevor. He awkwardly started a conversation by saying, "Interesting group of people, wouldn't you say?" Trevor replied, "Oh, I don't know. Overall, I prefer engineers and pilots myself." Of course, the ambassador was offended, but he couldn't show it. "You're Trevor Van Leeuwan, aren't you?" "I'm Conan Dietrich, U.S. ambassador to Germany," and put out his hand. Trevor shook it in a friendly way, saying, "Yes, sir, I am Trevor Van Leeuwan, and I am a bit out of my element here." "Well, yes, I suppose I do understand your feelings on the matter," the ambassador commiserated. "I myself was in business for most of my career. The State Department was not my cup of tea either at first, but since then I've worked with some top-notch people." Trevor knew exactly who Conan Dietrich was. His company, Specialty Coders, became very fat on the public purse, where for every 2 lines of code they wrote, they invoiced the government for 3. Their contracts were all cost-plus, so they made a killing. There was not a senator on the Hill with whom Dietrich was not on first-name basis. "I'm sure they are. My great-grandfather said that a man always works best where he is the happiest," Trevor exclaimed. Now, to make an uncomfortable conversation even worse, here comes Malcolm Aldrich III, CEO and chairman of Berkeley Arms. "Conan, good to see you, as always. And Mr. Van Leeuwan, I presume. I'm so glad you could make it this evening. Jane told me she invited you here on a whim, and I always trust her whims." The fake laughter was excruciating already. "Here's an idea." Malcolm tried to look as if it had just come to him. "Let us adjourn to the pool room. The noise is not so bad in there, and it is much less crowded." "Here we go," thought Trevor. "Put up your tray tables and strap yourselves in." They followed Aldrich toward the rear of the suite, and sure enough, there was a pool table there, and a smaller but still open bar. "Let me make another introduction, Mr. Trevor Van Leeuwan. This is Sir Richard Marchand." "Sir Richard, this is Trevor Van Leeuwan of Van Leeuwan Corporation." Shaking hands with Sir Richard Marchand, Trevor vaguely remembered who he was. Sir Richard was the top man in MI6. To ride this one out, he was going to need another single malt, so he ordered one from this bar as he had finished off the last one. And back again were Commander Kynaston and General Campbell, who just appeared to be along for the ride. The bartender made sure everyone had a fresh drink and went on a long break, as instructed. Taking stock of the room, there were 2 CEOs, one for civilian and one for military, 1 ambassador, 2 intelligence officers, and a military attaché. Last but not least, President Lavoisier marched into the room and looked around, acting like he had personally delivered Van Leeuwan up to the group. Kynaston and Campbell racked up for a game of 9-ball, trying to act casual. Malcolm Aldrich III, being the good host, assumed the bartender's position and asked Lavoisier for his order. "Cognac, please, Mr. Aldrich." Malcolm, looking at no one in particular, asked, "Mr. Van Leeuwan, how has business been for you of late? As you are not a public company, it is difficult to get your measure. After your discoveries on Mars, I should imagine things are looking very bright indeed. If it was possible, I might sell my own stock and buy yours." He laughed. Now, replied Trevor, "I can follow your stock and see you have nothing to worry about. But for now, I could say that I am well pleased with how our people are doing and that the company is in good shape. Other than our own health, what more could we ask for, right?" "There's always the unknown, Mr. Van Leeuwan," injected Ambassador Dietrich. "We all have concerns for our security long term. Would you not agree?" Van Leeuwan looked thoughtful for a moment. "Security is so subjective, don't you think? So much can be given up in trying to achieve it, but can it ever be achieved sufficiently? It is one of those things like love that one never can get enough of," Trevor waxed. "Some of us here could lose our jobs tomorrow, just like that," as he snapped his fingers. He was looking at Kynaston and Campbell as he said it. They looked away. "Monsieur Lavoisier has an election in 2 months. How secure is that?" he continued, as Lavoisier winced. Yes, I see your point, Mr. Van Leeuwan," the ambassador said, trying to cut off that line of thinking. Let me put it another way, Malcolm jumped in. Humankind is spreading out, but do we really want to lose our connection to each other? I mean, if it had not been for our connections, we would have had total disaster from the Mars blight, and then that virus outbreak only 5 years ago. Van Leeuwan could not resist toying with him. Oh, I never once felt that our various colonies and outposts were disconnected. Trevor added, our own company services nearly all of it at one time or another, along with our competitors. Our own labs synthesized and distributed medication to all of the Mars settlements. And didn't some Berkeley tenders rescue those 48 miners stranded on Ceres last year? Just last week, our security people rescued a wayward windsurfer in the South Pacific. Commander Kynaston thought he would give it a shot. Mr. Van Leeuwan, what we're trying to say is that if we were all under one roof, as it were, like a family, then we could share a lot more, like information. You, of all people, should realize just how important that can be. Trevor turned more serious, even though he knew exactly where they were going. You mean like some sort of consortium or cartel? Is that what you're getting at, Commander? The commander looked a little insulted. If it is inside information or price fixing, then of course not. That is not what I'm saying at all. Ambassador Dietrich tried to bring the conversation away from the cliff edge. Of course, what we're discussing is all on the level, all above board. What we are exploring is a way to bring a bit more order to the solar system. Ambassador Dietrich, Trevor proceeded, bringing order to the solar system? I don't mean to be disrespectful, but that sentence strikes me as absurd. That's a rather grandiose concept you are espousing there. Van Leeuwan knew he shouldn't, but he asked anyway. Excuse me, Mr. Aldrich, could I get another single malt, please? Malcolm poured him another, and he made sure to sip this one more slowly. Throughout this conversation, Sir Richard Marchand had been completely silent. What say you, Sir Richard? How do you think we should bring order to the solar system? Sir Richard took a few puffs of his pipe. Well, where there is law, there is order, is there not? Sir Richard replied. Trevor thought this statement to be exceedingly ironic coming from an MI6 man who would not be employed if he had to play by the rules. I guess the first questions I'd have to ask are these. 1. What is it exactly that is out of order? 2. Who is defining what order is? 3. What parties are complaining about a lack of order now? Ambassador Dietrich rejoined, what is proposed, rather, is not necessarily a restoration of order in the present, but a guarantee of it in the future, a commonality, the same set of rules for everybody. We have approached you because you represent a significant portion of the business community, especially on Mars and in the belt. Trevor took another sip of his whiskey as he repressed a well-deserved outburst, but proceeded calmly. Well, you know, we are pretty satisfied with the status quo, other than the pirate situation, and I'm sure we'll find a creative solution for that. We've handled the worst crises in the frontier settlements to everyone's satisfaction, so I really cannot see what you're getting at. Is this the usual solution in search of a problem? This was precisely why they could not engage Van Leeuwan. Though he was emotional about his beliefs, he did not show it, but forced his adversaries back onto the logical path. I know exactly where you gentlemen are going with this discussion. You want to convince me that some unseen structure would be an improvement in everyone's lives. Let's ask Monsieur Lavoisier here directly. Is French Polynesia better or worse for the operations of VLC and the surrounding support industries? Is not crime way down and performance in education way up? Lavoisier looked annoyed. Well, when I entered office, Trevor interrupted. Our operations began long before you entered office. Have the statistics not improved year over year, despite who the ruling party is? True, Lavoisier admitted, and shut up. Commander Kynaston had calmed down some. Would not a treaty remove a lot of the burden from your company as well as others in the frontier? There's that problem you mentioned with the pirates earlier. With a treaty, there would be warships patrolling in the belt, and in any other hot spots. Outside the current frontier, you have no protection. We both know that is not practical, replied Van Leeuwan. The belt is far too large for even a fleet of pursuit cruisers. Any apprehension would be by chance alone, and you couldn't justify sending escorts for every shipment both ways. You might be able to sell it to people on Earth, but not Mars or the frontier settlements. Besides that, no government has ever guaranteed protection, or would back it up even if they could. Where there is no duty of protection, there is no duty of allegiance. Am I right? The actual victims in that scheme are never made whole. The most practical solution is for us to arm ourselves. No, gentlemen, This really smacks of a Sol system land grab on the order of that in the western United States, or the attempted grab at 16 Psyche 10 years ago. A treaty would be the first push of the camel's nose under the tent. People on the frontier do quite well contracting with each other, company to company or neighbor to neighbor. Lavoisier gained some of his composure. You know, Trevor, speaking from personal experience, these alliances can be quite positive. You and your people could be helped immensely through greater cooperation. You should see the wisdom in riding the wave of history, not letting it swamp you. And there it was, the not-so-veiled threat at the end of their plea. Well, gentlemen, Van Leeuwan said as he finished off his whiskey, you certainly give me a lot to consider, and I hope that the reverse is true. But if you will excuse me, I am still a little disoriented from the time change. So with that, I will say good evening to you all. On that note, Trevor made his way back to the main room, where he thanked Ms. Sanderson once again on his way out. Ambassador Dietrich was a little astonished that his charms had not worked on Trevor Van Leeuwan. Very subtle, Monsieur Lavoisier. The waves of history? President Lavoisier brushed the rebuke aside. Please, gentlemen, I have known this Van Leeuwan for several years now, and have watched him in action, as they say. Believe me when I tell you this ambush did not take him by surprise. Messieurs had best do your research on the Van Leeuwan clan and their operations. His kind does not respond to gentle persuasion or flattery. We must combine our resources and ingenuity in order to bring him down or over to our side. Lavoisier continued. I have tried for some time to set red tape snares for VLC, but they run a very clean operation, at least in my neck of the woods. Monsieur Marchand, have your people on Pitcairn looked into this angle? And Ambassador Dietrich, what can your federal government or State Department do to tie them up? Whatever we do must be subtle. He has too many friends. Ambassador Dietrich agreed that more detailed planning was needed and that they should get together again before the conference was over. General Campbell and Commander Kynaston played a few more rounds of nine-ball as their superiors chatted with assorted VIPs filtering in and out. Australian attaché General Jiemba Campbell came from a long military tradition. His forefathers had fought in every conflict since the Great War and had proved their dedication to Australia many times over. They had done this for 200 years, as they were still treated like second-hand citizens. Now here he was at this meeting where he was assumed to be one of the in-group who makes the rules for everyone else, or at least one of their bagmen. He was unsettled by his earlier conversation with Mr. Van Leeuwan, and he was even more unsettled after this raw display of intimidation. Was this why he served? And who exactly was he serving in the end? Chapter 10. Jiemba. Trevor stayed only one more day in Berlin, after having been to the main event already. His people on the ground would scour any new technical developments at the conference. What he truly wanted to do at this point was to head back to Magellan for a few months, per his usual cycle. It might be necessary, after all, to rally his troops, so to speak. However, it would not look good for him to pull a disappearing act at this time. There would be too much gossip, and he would not put it past those jokers to subpoena him before some government committee. After last night's little performance, he contacted Megan to fill her in. Though he wasn't terribly worried in the short term, some form of government harassment was to be expected. Megan, I had a run-in with the elite last night, so I thought I would call and give you a short synopsis. After a brief overview, Megan cut him off. Trevor, it has already started. We are already fielding calls about this permit or that one, this form or that one, that we have already sent in triplicate. The first thing I thought of was you over there raking up the muck. What did you say to set them off this time? We are also getting static over on Pitcairn and in the States. The picture was starting to crystallize for Van Leeuwan. This plan had evidently advanced quite a bit in the last several months. It wasn't just a rumor anymore. Megan, could you book me a red-eye flight this evening? I have everything I need from this side of the world, so I should get back to Taha'a for a little strategic planning. As usual, Megan was all over it. She could hear the request in his tone of voice. I've got you a business-class seat on Virgin, departing from the Frankfurt spaceport at 12:30 your time, gate A4. The ticket is being transmitted. Is there anything else we can do for you? The rain of paper is just a sprinkle right now, but I have an idea that a monsoon is planned. Trevor continued, Oh, Megan, there is one more thing. I do have a French passport along with the American. When you are down there shuffling paper with legal, could you find out what it would take to get me Mars residency status? Megan was puzzled. Sure, Chief. What do you have in mind? I'd rather wait until I see you in person before I go any further. It's just an idea I have percolating, answered Van Leeuwan. The company driver found a clear, wide-open sky lane to Frankfurt at this late hour, so the trip took very little time. The Germans had no speed limits for their low-level aerial traffic. In addition to the Autobahn, there was still some civilization left on Earth. On board the plane, he was putting away his 2 small carry-ons, overcoat, and hat, when he noticed someone in uniform farther down the aisle. Taking his seat, he recognized General Campbell. When they had reached cruising altitude of 30 kilometers, he motioned to the general that they should adjourn to the business lounge. From their previous encounters, Trevor felt there was still something redeemable in that man. This red eye was a bit underbooked, so there was plenty of room. So are you going to visit us in the islands, General? Van Leeuwan said, genuinely curious. No, sir. I have some urgent business back with Foreign Affairs. DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So Tahiti is just a stopover. The direct flights were booked. When you do have some time to spare, I hope that you'll visit us, Trevor smiled. Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, I like that. Those 2 areas need to be thought of together more often. It would ease a lot of distress in the worlds. The general followed. What about you, sir? That was a long way to travel for only 2 days. I hope you got something out of it. Some blokes plan half the year for the Berlin conference. I'm sure that in your line of work, General, sometimes you accomplish your goals quickly, and some seem like they will never be reached. Events can be quite unpredictable, Van Leeuwan continued. Von Moltke said, no great plan survives first contact with the enemy. Is this not so? The double entendre was not lost on General Campbell. At times, it is difficult even determining who the enemy is. Not looking specifically at Trevor, but past him, Van Leeuwan asked, So, Jiemba, you mentioned that you would like a little more space duty. I have the feeling Mars is going to become a lot more interesting. What about a transfer there? I know that I will be spending much more time Mars side, at least for a while, at least while our operations are ramping up. But then my focus is not your focus. Jiemba added, It is true that there has been a lot more activity in the government reserve compounds, and the independent settlements are like the Wild West, Australian and American. There are so many settlers out there with a whole different view of things. I need to get outside the bubble more often. Now that's a healthy attitude, Jiemba. New vantage points generally spice things up. I've been thinking along the same lines. Earth operations are going pretty well these days. I may even take up our seat on the Mars Frontier Council. Van Leeuwan knew that little gem would rattle some cages where it mattered. The general looked curious. I've heard of it and vaguely know what they do, but are you seriously considering a move like that? I didn't think they had any real powers. Trevor continued. I've been doing some research along with our legal and historical departments at VLC. It is really quite surprising what was agreed to all those years ago. It appears that the various treaty powers and the frontier settlements are quite separate beyond the original government compounds. I guess after the Mars Blight, they kind of tucked their tails between their legs. After handling it in such an abysmal manner, they had no choice. They essentially wrote off 50,000 people. So yes, all power was conceded, as if there was ever any power to grant or concede. I guess they just figured they would muscle their way back in after everyone had forgotten. General Campbell was starting to understand. It seems that quite a few people have forgotten. Don't the settlements contract with the government compounds for many of their services? Things like police, fire, water, and oxygen recycling, enclosure repair, things like that? Van Leeuwan answered, Well, that is what most people believe because they just take those things for granted. Most of the frontier settlements do not do that, and there's no requirement for them to do so. You can believe it. Those settlers have not forgotten a thing. Did you know that 80% of the food grown on Mars is grown on independent plantations, and 75% of the power is provided from there? In addition, some of the biggest cargo ports are located in the independent territories. One territory has a nuclear power station because no one in the government compounds wanted one near them. They sure do want the power, though. You see, this is exactly why you should get yourself transferred. The experience will be truly eye-opening. It was amazing, thought Jiemba, how much the experts would assume about any situation. They were so anxious to model the world on static initial conditions that they became blind. The people around them were so desperate for a soothsayer they would glom onto every word. He would give Trevor's suggestion of transfer some serious thought. He might want first-row tickets to this show. He might even become a soothsayer. The hyperliner moved through the black of night and the black of space toward the light side of the Earth. It would not be long now before they would touch down in Tahiti. Trevor and Jiemba chatted away about deep-sea fishing, scuba diving, and other activities they both enjoyed. There was too much serious talk on this trip. Chapter 11. Changing of the Guard. The next day, after a good rest, Trevor tasked Megan with getting a war room set up and to identify some of the key staff they would need. This was an activity in which Megan excelled. She was a master at organization. Van Leeuwan informed everyone at the first meeting what had gone down in Berlin and some of his suspicions that seemed to be coming to fruition. He outlined some of his thoughts on strategy and asked advice on an important question he'd been wrestling with. As a counter to the powers that were locking onto them, what would they suggest? As much as I loathed the idea, I initially thought of throwing my hat into the ring with Lavoisier. Right now, he does not have any serious competition. There are a lot of launch centers in these islands, and that means something. The idea was that if I were running against him, that might stop the paper blizzard from the bureaucrats. Or we could put up a candidate to run against him. The participants looked around the table and discussed it briefly. What else were you proposing? Asked his IT guru, Shauna. Trevor continued. The other idea is the more direct approach. I'm thinking of taking up my seat on the Mars Frontier Council. The council has not been very active of late. I don't believe they understand the danger yet. If I took my seat, I might have a good chance at the chairmanship. Shauna said, that sounds like the best strategy to start with. You can get a lot of people to rally by getting them up to speed, and it will really throw a monkey wrench into their takeover plans. Those are the people with the most to lose, besides. Megan seconded Shauna's opinion. I agree, Trevor. I already have a few ideas of whom we could get to replace Lavoisier here. Maybe that fisherman, Jacques Arama? He's pretty popular, and he's a tough old bird. It's going to get ugly, but once the islanders see just how dirty the game is, they should be very supportive. I did some checking, and your status in the Mars Frontier settlements won't affect your citizenship at all. You can take your seat on the council immediately after you take up residence, but there's not a vote for chairman for another 2 months. Van Leeuwan took it all in. He had a great team here. That's all right, Megan. Taking up my seat will get the message across for a start. I can work out of any of our offices over there. The next order of business, Megan continued, is this transmission received from the Philo T. Farnsworth this morning. It appears that on their outbound trip they detected at least 3 pirate craft on the inner side of the belt, just outside of the commercial lanes. They managed to elude them, but figure they will be waiting for them on the return trip when they are fully loaded. The new wrinkle is that they detected some cruisers from joint space operations in the same vicinity. Trevor smiled. Like the cavalry, they will ride to the rescue, no doubt. When do they expect to pass back through that area? Megan looked at her viewer. They should be through in about 12 hours. Trevor thought for a minute and asked, do we know the whereabouts of the Faraday? How far is she from the same point? Thumbing through her viewer, Megan replied, the Faraday is about 7 hours from there. She should have finished offloading that equipment at the Mendeleev mine by now. Do you have new orders for her? After her last stunt, Van Leeuwan thought he had better not put Captain McDonough up to any more mischief, but she was Johnny on the spot. All right, Trevor sat back. Give Captain McDonough these orders. Proceed to the coordinates for the last sighting of the pirates. Shadow the Philo T. Farnsworth, escorting her out of the belt and onto her destination. Scan the surrounding area for both pirate craft and the JSO cruisers at all times. 3 pirate craft have been sighted thus far, and at least 2 cruisers. You may interfere with any pirate attacks on the Farnsworth or the cruisers with the tools you have at hand. The only stipulation is that no one gets hurt. Do not damage the cruisers, but you must interfere with their operations if they go after the Farnsworth. Their weapons are real, and like I said, we don't want anyone to get hurt. Naturally, all of your operations must take place in stealth mode. We want to leave them as mystified as your Stowaway was. You will be sent the evasion track used by the Farnsworth for avoiding detection in the belt. That should help you match course with them. Megan recorded the orders as given. They would be sent on the next uplink to Faraday. With the war room meeting wrapped up, Trevor gave instructions for some of his personal items to be packed up for the trip to Mars. He was going to have to get used to Mars racquetball all over again. He was having the Mickelson take him there rather than spending 5 weeks on a transport liner. And besides, he would be able to monitor the activities of the Faraday from there. He could use the extra time on Mars to work in peace or maybe do a little rock climbing. People in this system had to remain under the impression that it took him just as long to get around as it did everyone else. So he would alter the flight manifest on VLC transports to make them appear as his mode for interplanetary travel. He thought it best to hold off on his announcement rejoining the council until his blackout date was much closer to the end. It would be too awkward to go in and out of hiding to respond to the press in person. There would be more of a 1-2 punch after Megan got their candidate for French Polynesia launched. Jacques Orama was surprised to get a message from Megan asking if they could meet for dinner. They knew each other only by reputation, but both admired the other. Jacques Orama had one of the largest fishing fleets in the islands. He was a no-nonsense, hard-as-nails sea captain, as well as a leading businessman. His clan was an intricate part of local history. Members of their family had dined with Captain Cook, or so the story went. The sword and other artifacts they had to offer as proof were displayed in the lobby of their headquarters in Tahiti. Megan had never personally met Mr. Orama, but Trevor let her know that he was a straight shooter who did not spread gossip. Whatever they discussed would stay between themselves and their trusted confidants. Megan, not by accident, had set their dinner meeting at the Bounty, one of the more posh hotels in Papeete. They would be seen. Jacques arrived right on time, and a waiter showed them to their table by the window overlooking the marina. Always a gentleman, he pulled out her chair, seated her, then seated himself. The waiter took their drink orders and handed them their menus. "We supply this hotel with all their seafood," Orama exclaimed after the waiter left, "so we should be sure to get the best selection." He laughed. Captain Orama knew Megan from her charity work around the islands, and though he had not attended her events, he often had his people bid on items at the auctions. After a pleasant dinner and the discussion of mutual friends, it was time to get down to business. There was no hurry, as more of the local gentry who saw them together, the bigger impact they would have. This is where the rubber meets the road, Megan thought to herself. "So, Mr. Orama, there's talk of drafting you to run for president. Is there anything to this? I would never have made you for a politician." A smile came over Jacques' weather-beaten face. "Aha, you're trying to reel me in with my own seafood as bait?" Megan continued. "I've been asking around quietly. You have more of a following than you realize. Everyone knows that Lavoisier is just another climber, using the Polynesians as a ladder. He takes no interest in the local issues, because he would rather be traveling around the world on their francs." "Perhaps I should ask why your boss, Mr. Van Leeuwan, or even you yourself do not stand for the presidency," Captain Orama pondered. "His name has come up in every round of elections, either for the assembly or the presidency. You were quite well known yourself, though you are much too humble to admit it. As for Lavoisier, I would concur. He is like the fish still there at the end of the market. No one wants him, and he smells the same. But you have to take him home. Whenever any real emergencies come up, it's always the Renards, the Van Leeuwans, and we Oramas who take the lead, while he and his minions take the credit. I would swear that he only has parties, summits, and made-up junkets on his calendar." Megan took another bite of her creme brulee. "As for me running, I am so flattered that you would consider me, but I'm busy trying to make myself indispensable at VLC. As for Trevor, you know how much he loathes politicians. The thought of him becoming one might even give him a stroke. He considered it, but what he's gearing up for is retaking his seat on the Mars Frontier Council. Keep that to yourself for now. Perhaps that is a distinction without a difference. Issues on the frontier are closer to home for him and for the company. So perhaps there is some comfort in the idea that Trevor would be suffering in a hell parallel to yours." Orama laughed, his boisterous laugh providing an excuse for a few heads to turn toward their table. "Alas, I will not toy with you, mon chéri. I have indeed been quietly preparing to unseat our self-serving president. He would rather be in Paris, but let's provide him with a reason to go there. I trust that I may count on the support of the Van Leeuwans and yourself." Megan was pleased. Mission accomplished for now. "Why, yes, of course the Van Leeuwans, the Renards, and I dare say the people are fully behind you. I may even carve out some time to canvass for you myself." Chapter 12. Panning for Pirates. The Michelson was ready and waiting for Trevor and what personal items he needed to set up on Mars. He accelerated his timetable because he'd had guilty thoughts about sending Captain McDonough on such a mission on her own. There was no question of her abilities, but a little backup could go a long way. There was time to catch up with the Faraday with plenty to spare, then proceed to the rendezvous point for a little reconnaissance before the Philo T. Farnsworth arrived. Of the crew of the Farnsworth, only Captain Michelo Quintana and his first officer, Carolina Leakey, were aware of the more advanced ships in the VLC fleet. Both were aware by now that they would be receiving assistance with any pirates, and they were ready with their earpieces to receive direction from the other ships. This was the first time that an escort had ever been available, and they felt better already. None of them wanted to spend 4 weeks in a cramped escape pod, or worse, no escape pod. At the end of the shipping lane and the beginning of the belt, though there was no clear boundary, the Faraday was waiting as the Michelson arrived. They had at least 5 hours before the Farnsworth would appear, so they coordinated into a search pattern to look for any bad guys. Van Leeuwan had taken command of the Michelson, but he assigned Captain Brigitte Lottie and her crew to head up the search while he familiarized himself with the gravity arrays once again. Captain McDonough had shown quite a bit of creativity with them, he had to admit. He wanted to learn from her example. After about 4 hours, the 2 crews had located the 3 pirate ships mentioned in the reports, and there was the Farnsworth, about 20 kilometers ahead of them, dropping to a lower solar orbit. The 2 joint space operations cruisers were not far behind. They were big, had plenty of maneuvering fuel, armor, and offensive weapons. Pirates had the fuel and appeared to have weapons, but there was no indication they were heavily armored, as there was not much their normal prey could do to them. They appeared to be just modified freighters, but with modular, removable armaments, handy for entering any regular spaceport. The scanners indicated that the 3 pirate ships were maneuvering closer and closer to the Farnsworth, branching out to cover her on opposite sides, but out of each other's line of fire. They took up positions in a roughly triangular pattern and were working to match her velocity while closing the distance between them. All ships save the Faraday and Michelson were limited to Newton's laws, so there was only so much they could do in either attacking or evasive moves. Of course, the pirates had guns on movable turrets, so they could do a lot of compensation for position that way. The channel to the Farnsworth captain and first officer was left open on both the Michelson and Faraday, and the inevitable first warning came over loud and clear from one of the pirate ships. "To the captain and crew of the Philo T. Farnsworth, allow our ships to match speed so that you may be boarded. If you do not do so, you will be fired upon." An obviously disguised voice announced over the speakers. Van Leeuwan almost had to laugh, it was so cliché Hollywood, but still, he did not know exactly what was going to happen. He had a good idea, but he had to be prepared for anything. He had indicated to Captain Quintana and his first officer they should comply with this expected order. It would take some time before any of the pirate cruisers could close enough distance for docking to commence, and he hoped they could spring a few surprises. All ships were slowing their velocities with respect to their solar orbits and dropping toward the inner system. This velocity was quite considerable, though relative to each other it was not noticeable. In any case, it was unstoppable if they wished to return to Mars or Earth, excluding the Faraday and Michelson. Van Leeuwan had designated the ship from whence the first threatening transmission originated as Pirate 1. The ships looked virtually identical and had any visible call numbers removed or covered over. In an apparent attempt at whimsy, each ship had adopted one of their many versions of pirate flags of old displayed on their external viewers. Pirate 1 was moving slowly toward the Farnsworth, while the other 2 held their position. The JSO cruisers had moved to within less than 1 kilometer behind, but it was not clear what they were going to do. There had been no communications from them at all. Despite the old-timey movies showing asteroid belts as flying gravel pits, this was not reality. Space was very big, asteroids were dark, and one would have to try hard to actually hit one. Fortunately, the Faraday and Michelson brought their own gravel. Pirate Ship 2 was holding a position above the Farnsworth by about 500 meters. Aboard the Faraday, Kimberly had been running computer simulations with the gravity arrays in anticipation of this confrontation. Eyeing Pirate 2, she had the arrays generate one nice gravity bubble, or basically a section of curved space, to the starboard side of Pirate 2. Pirate 2 was thousands of tons, so she wasn't sure if the field would be strong enough to do what she wanted it to do. Aboard the Michelson, Trevor's first mate, Captain Brigida Lottie, told him that Pirate 2 had automatically started firing thrusters to try to reverse the deflection caused by the gravity bubble. Immediately, he understood what Kimberly was doing and directed Brigida to blow her own gravity bubble and superimpose it with that of the Faraday. That did it. The combined fields were now telling Pirate 2 which way to fall, and she was trying to fall up, away from the sun. Her compensational thrusters were firing almost constantly in a vain threat to correct course. The unknown captain of Pirate 2 was starting to panic. He came over the comms in an excited voice, shouting about being pushed or pulled, and that his compensators were firing full blast. From Pirate 1, he was ordered to do anything he could to correct course, but everyone on the other ships knew that he would run out of propellant if this kept up. There was no advice offered to him as to how to escape his predicament. Finally, in desperation, he ordered the thrusters off, and a restart of his main engines, gimbal to both compensate their heading and to break free of whatever had grabbed him. It worked. There was enough thrust to get loose of the gravitational anomaly. The captain of Pirate 2, noticeably shaken, came over the comms one more time. "That's it. We won't be able to help you guys on this one. Not if I cannot stay on station. I need enough propellant to get home, or to the next way station." Van Leeuwan, over their private comms, said, "Nice work, Kimberly. I'm slow, but I do catch on eventually. That's one down and two to go. Do you want to try some speed bumps next?" Kimberly told Justin and his team to get ready in cargo bay 2. They had a nice collection of nickel-iron debris, from pebbles sized up to 10 kilograms or so. These they shared with the Michelson. By this time, Pirate 1 had stopped movement toward any boarding she might have considered, and held position about 200 meters from the port side of the Farnsworth. Van Leeuwan said, "Kimberly, I don't like the look of that turret in the rear of Pirate 1. Does that look like a railgun to you?" Kimberly replied, "It sure does. Maybe we should have it removed. It would be safer for everyone. Justin, are you ready with the gravel and some of the bigger stuff? Let's start with the gravel." Several handfuls of gravel were released out of the lock to be picked up by the gravity arrays, which spread them out over several square meters, while the Faraday moved in position toward the bow of Pirate 1. The arrays moved the gravel field ahead of Pirate 1 and imparted enough delta V to catch someone's attention. The crew of Pirate 1 could hear the impact of hundreds of projectiles against the front of the hull. Several external pressure and hydraulic lines took a beating. The crew was hard at damage control while the captain shouted orders. After a few seconds of wild firing, the compensators righted the ship and resumed position alongside the Farnsworth. The captain of Pirate 1 gave orders to Pirate 3 to hold position. What they were experiencing was just some trance anomalies with the asteroids. Still, there was no word from the JSO cruisers. It was like they were not even there, except they had moved much closer to the action. There wasn't a lot of protecting and serving going on. Van Leeuwan had loaded some 5 to 10 kilogram rocks into his gravity arrays and guided the Michelson ahead of Pirate 3. She looked like she was sporting a railgun turret in the rear, with either a laser cannon or a particle weapon toward the bow on the starboard side. They were not very powerful weapons of those types, unless she had a nuclear reactor on board, but they could do a lot of damage to an unarmed freighter. Trevor piloted the Michelson about in a very long, lazy circle and headed for the bow of Pirate 3. Brigida was guiding the port and starboard gravity arrays separately, each grasping a line of 3 large projectiles. She had the computer lock on to the 2 turrets, targeting them with the little surprises at the focus of each array. The arrays were programmed to shut down with their payloads about 50 meters from their targets. This is incredibly reckless, Trevor thought to himself, but I know it will have a huge psychological effect. He increased the relative speed between the two ships to 30,000 meters per second. When the arrays released, their payload slammed into the two turrets parallel to the axis of Pirate 3. A shower of sparks and liquid metal flew from the center of the rear turret as it was ripped from its mounts on Pirate 3. What was left of it flipped ass over tea kettle down the aft end of the ship and into space. The front pod disintegrated completely, followed by a shower of electrical sparks from whatever was powering it. The cables were dancing around above a crater of torn metal, shooting great blue sparks whenever their ends flailed low enough to the hull. As Pirate 3 was hit, her great mass went into a spin, then tumbled as her compensation thrusters fought to straighten her out. Over the comms, they could hear the captain of Pirate 1 shouting, "What's happened? What the hell is happening over there?" The captain of Pirate 3 was fighting his own battles, barking orders to his crew to shut off various airlocks, power conduits, and the like to save his ship. His computer was handling the compensators, and the tumbling slowed considerably. Van Leeuwan had calculated his attack carefully. He wanted to smash their weapon systems, but not permanently disable the ship. Being a shipbuilder himself, he knew what that class was capable of. There would be a whole lot of explaining to do when they brought her in for repairs, that is, if she stopped at the first port she could limp into. He consulted with Brigida and Kimberly. "What do you two think? Do you think these folks have some clandestine port or ports somewhere? I hate to let them scurry off to some spider hole without any publicity at all." Brigida spoke up. "Captain, they must have some place to hold up somewhere before the primary shipping lanes. They need a place to strap on that gunnery they are sporting without too many eyes on them. It's likely they have some fuel dumps way out here, or they could not operate." Captain McDonough agreed and suggested perhaps they should disable Pirate 1 to the point where she would have to be taken back in tandem with Pirate 3, which was space-worthy, but disarmed, or send out an SOS. No matter what, their pictures were going to end up splashed across the system. They just didn't know it yet. There was still no indication that the JSO cruisers were making any moves or contact. Aboard JSO Cruiser 0016, on loan from Space Command UK, the debate was raging. What should they do? They had not expected any of this. Major Sun recalled Commander Kynaston telling them before they left that they were just to observe, but if there were any extraordinary circumstances, they must act on their own judgment. He would not be there to bail them out, and he would deny he had any connection to any of it. They could just leave these jokers out here, but that didn't seem right. There was no guarantee they would make it back under these conditions. In the meantime, Van Leeuwan and his team had made their decision. Captain McDonough and Trevor each maneuvered their ships aft of Pirate 1 and powered up their gravity arrays. Initially at low power, they probed in tandem over the rear engine spikes, getting initial feel for them. Randomly, between their arrays, they caved in about 1/3 of them as a shudder went through the ship. The pirate crew was in full panic now, not knowing what was happening. This was a trip to hell. They started paging through their ship's camera views. One crewman shrieked as he pointed to the damage to the engine spikes. "We're all going to die out here, aren't we? We're going to die out here." The captain fielded damage reports, but wasted no time in contacting Pirate 3 to let them know they were dead in the water. There was not enough thrust in the remaining engines to break into the inner system. On board the Farnsworth, Captain Quintana briefly recessed to his quarters. Just to make sure there was a permanent record, he transferred all of the video data and log entries to the Faraday at Michelson. Several more copies he hid in special directories only he could access. He had a feeling the tales, if they ever came out, were going to be long and tall. He re-emerged on the bridge in time to answer an incoming message from JSO Cruiser 0016. Would wonders ever cease? Major Sun addressed the Farnsworth. "To the freighter, Philo T. Farnsworth. This is Major Sun, commanding JSO Cruiser 0016. Do you read me?" "We read you loud and clear," replied Captain Quintana. "We seem to be the only ones to come through this unmolested. You were very lucky. It is a very good thing that we came by," Sun continued. "Are you in need of assistance?" Captain Quintana said, "No, not at all, but thank you for asking. We would just like to be on our way so that we may make our deliveries on time. Our customers are waiting." Major Sun said a little more formally, "We really need to come aboard your ship, take your statements, and make sure that you are all right to continue." Captain Quintana replied, I don't think so. As I said, we do not have time to spare. And if you were here all this time, why didn't you try to help us? But I insist, the exasperated Major's son returned. He wasn't used to people talking to him this way. By what right are you insisting we do anything? By what authority? Asked Captain Quintana. There was already laughter on the bridges of the Faraday and Michelson. By the authority of joint space operations, shouted Major's son. Joint space operations? Is that a thing? Where does the authority for that come from? Are you going to shoot at us if we try to continue on our way? Major's son tried to collect himself. Our authority comes from the treaty organizations of Earth and Mars. Captain Quintana replied, I just don't see it. What facts do you have to prove that this authority exists and that it applies to us, even way out here in the asteroid belt? You can't just make an assertion like that without some evidence to back it up. That's simply not logical. Besides, even if it were true, your jurisdiction just does not cover us here. Your treaty says nothing of the kind. Even if it did, we didn't sign your treaty, so what gives? Major's son was in too deep and had no answers. Leave that to someone with a higher pay grade. All right, go on your way. Someone will catch up with you later. JSO cruisers 0016 and 0019 made arrangements for coupling to Pirate 1 and Pirate 3 in order to get them back to the inner system safely. The cruisers were powerful ships and would have plenty of thrust along with the pirate ship's own engines to slow them down. The thought of just cutting them loose and injecting them into the proper orbits occurred to Captain Sun, but he would have to consult with Commander Kynaston. No matter what, he was committed now. He would have to send repair crews aboard both ships to make sure they were both space-worthy enough to make the trip. That meant he would have to go whole hog and arrest everyone they found. After warning the two pirate ships not to resist, the coupling procedures were completed. Detached units of the Royal Marines from both cruisers stormed the two pirate ships. All weapons were collected. All but a few key personnel, such as officers and ship's engineers, were confined to their respective brigs. Since they were all basically going to the same destination, the JSO cruisers and their new tandem friends, plus the Philo-T Farnsworth, were all still within sight of each other. Captain Quintana made sure there was plenty of video and other data being collected by the Farnsworth. Finally, it occurred to Captain Sun that they should not be operating within sight of the Farnsworth. He gave the order for JSO 0016 and JSO 0019 to break further to get them away from the civilian freighter. Captain Sun ordered his repair crews, along with the pirate engineers and officers, to catalog the damage to their ships and to begin any critical repairs. Sections that could not be saved with tools and materials out here were to be closed off. Damage to Pirate 1 was confined largely to the engines, with no great damage being done to life support systems. Damage to Pirate 3 was far more substantial. The rear turret tearing off had left 3 adjacent compartments open to space. They could only be repaired in port. Life support systems, command and control, as well as the engines, were still operational. There were some minor injuries, but no lives were lost, as the gunnery was operated remotely. A full after-action report was recorded by a nervous Captain Sun and transmitted to Commander Kynaston. There would be many reports to come. He wondered what the commander's reaction would be.